When my husband told me he was working late, again, I smiled and kissed his cheek, tasting another woman's perfume on his collar. 6 months later, I was standing in my own funeral, watching the woman who destroyed my marriage prepare to steal my life. That's when I realized that sometimes the most vicious predators aren't the ones who hunt you, they're the ones who wait for you to die. If you're watching this, subscribe now and tell me in the comments if you've ever wanted to attend your own funeral. Trust me, what happens next will make your jaw hit the floor. The day I decided to die began like any other Tuesday. I was in my garden, the one place in our sprawling estate where I still felt like myself. My roses had just bloomed, their deep crimson petals unfurling in the morning light. I'd planted them 23 years ago, the day after Richard and I moved into this house. Back then, the estate had been little more than an ambitious renovation project, a crumbling Victorian mansion that Richard had fallen in love with and I had agreed to restore. Now it was the crown jewel of Westchester County, and everyone, especially Vivian, wanted it. Mrs. Montgomery, my housekeeper, Maria, approached with a cordless phone. "It's Dr. Levinson's office." I wiped soil from my gardening gloves and took the call. "Hello. Mrs. Montgomery, your test results are in. Could you come in this afternoon?" I didn't need to hear the rest. The tumor they'd found during my routine mammogram 6 weeks ago had grown. The surgery would be scheduled immediately. Recovery would be long, painful. But in that moment, as I stared at my blood-red roses, another thought bloomed, dark and dangerous as nightshade. What if I didn't have surgery at all? What if I let everyone believe the worst had happened? What if I died just for a little while? The idea should have shocked me. But after discovering your husband's affair with a woman 20 years younger, after finding their text messages, their hotel receipts, their plans for a future that didn't include you, nothing really shocks you anymore. I handed the phone back to Maria. "Tell Dr. Levinson I'll see him at 3. By 6 o'clock that evening, my plan had taken root. I called the only person I knew I could trust. Julianne, my sister's voice was thick with sleep. 3 time zones away in California, she was just waking up. "Is everything okay?" "I need your help," I said. "And I need you not to ask questions." I could almost hear her sitting up in bed, instantly alert. Julianne and I had been closer than close since childhood. We'd survived our father's alcoholism, our mother's depression, and the bitter poverty of our youth by protecting each other. Even now, with her successful law practice and my life of privilege, we maintained the bond forged in those desperate early years. "What do you need?" she asked without hesitation. "A place to disappear." There was a long pause. "Does this have to do with Richard? Or that woman?" "Both," I admitted. "And the house." "I need to." "Say no more," Julianne interrupted. "My beach house in Malibu is empty until January. No one knows I own it. It's under my business holdings. The caretaker comes once a week on Tuesdays. I'll call him and tell him my sister is staying there to recover from an illness." "Recovery," I echoed. "That's exactly what this is." "Eleanor," her voice softened. "Whatever you're planning, just promise me you won't do anything illegal." I thought about the forged medical records I was already planning, the death certificate I would need to falsify, the elaborate performance I would have to orchestrate. "I promise I won't get caught," I said instead. The next few weeks passed in a blur of careful preparation. I made sure Richard saw me taking pills, vitamins I'd repackaged in prescription bottles. I left pamphlets about hospice care, where he would find them. I scheduled appointments with specialists, then canceled them, leaving voicemails on our home phone about exploring other options and quality of life. Richard, of course, was too preoccupied with Vivian to notice much. He'd been working late nearly every night, coming home with that guilty half-smile that once broke my heart, but now only strengthened my resolve. "You look tired," he said one evening as he loosened his tie, the movement wafting Vivian's signature perfume toward me. "Chanel número 5. So predictable. "I am tired," I replied, not bothering to elaborate. He frowned slightly, a flicker of genuine concern in his eyes. That was the cruelest part about Richard. Those moments when the good man I married shone through the stranger he'd become. He sat beside me on the sofa, placing his hand over mine. Is there something you're not telling me? I almost laughed. Was there something I wasn't telling him? Nothing important, I lied, squeezing his hand once before standing. I'm going to bed early. Don't worry about being quiet when you come up. I knew he wouldn't come up at all. He'd wait until he thought I was asleep, then call her from his study. They'd whisper sweet nothings while I lay awake, plotting my resurrection. 2 days later, I left a tearful message for my children, Thomas, 32, a corporate lawyer in Manhattan, and Margaret, 29, a curator at the Met. Ask them to come home that weekend for a family dinner. There's something I need to tell you all, I said, my voice breaking just enough to sound authentic. By Friday night, they had gathered in our formal dining room, the same room where, years later, I would make my dramatic return from the dead. But that evening, I played a different role, the brave mother facing terminal illness. Stage 4, I told them, my eyes downcast. It spread to my lymph nodes, my bones. The doctors say I have 3 months, maybe 4. Margaret broke down immediately, her sobs filling the cavernous room. Thomas remained stone-faced, his jaw clenched in the same way Richard's did when he was fighting emotion. Richard himself sat motionless at the head of the table, his face ashen. I searched his expression for signs of relief, for any hint that he was calculating how quickly he could move Vivian into the master bedroom after I was gone. But I saw only shock and perhaps something else, guilt? There are treatments, Thomas said finally, his voice tight. Clinical trials. We could fly you to MD Anderson, to Sloan Kettering. I've made my decision. I cut him off gently. I don't want to spend my final months in hospital rooms. I want to be here, in my home, with my family. I emphasized the word my, watching Richard's face. And when the time comes, I want to go peacefully, on my own terms. Mom, no. Margaret reached for my hand. You can't just give up. I'm not giving up, I assured her. I'm choosing how to spend the time I have left. The rest of the dinner passed in a fog of tears and desperate questions. I'd prepared for all of them, researching terminal cancer thoroughly enough to speak convincingly about symptoms, treatments I'd declined, and the hospice care I'd arranged. What I hadn't prepared for was the raw grief in my children's eyes. For a moment, my resolve wavered. Was I being cruel, putting them through this pain? But then I remembered finding Richard and Vivian together in his office at last year's Christmas party, not in a compromising position, but something almost worse. They'd been standing by the window, his hand on the small of her back, both of them looking out at the snow-covered garden. It was the intimacy of the moment that gutted me. The way they stood together, so natural, so right, as if she belonged there, as if I were already gone. My children would survive this temporary grief. What they wouldn't survive was watching their inheritance, the home I'd spent decades perfecting, the estate that had been placed solely in my name when Richard's business faced bankruptcy 8 years ago, fall into Vivian's manicured hands. Over the next 2 months, I deteriorated right on schedule. I lost weight by restricting my diet and exercising secretly in the middle of the night. I purchased high-quality wigs, then lost my hair from chemotherapy I never received. I studied makeup techniques used for theater, gradually making myself appear more gaunt, more gray, more death-like. Richard, to his credit, hired round-the-clock nurses and even started coming home earlier. One night, I awoke to find him sitting beside my bed, his head in his hands. I'm sorry, he whispered, thinking I was asleep. God, Eleanor, I'm so sorry. For what, I wondered? For the affair? For wasting 35 years of my life? For already planning his future with another woman while I supposedly withered away? I kept my breathing even, my eyes closed. Let him apologize to the air. I was beyond forgiveness. Vivian, meanwhile, kept her distance, but not completely. She sent flowers once, a gaudy arrangement of lilies that made my alleged chemo nausea worse. The card read, "Thinking of you during this difficult time." The sheer audacity nearly made me laugh. At least she had the decency not to sign her full name, though everyone knew who V was. Richard's executive assistant. The woman half my age with a perfect body and the Ivy League degree, who'd worked alongside my husband for 3 years before becoming his mistress. I kept the flowers until they rotted, their sickly sweet scent filling my bedroom as the petals browned and fell. A memento mori, a reminder of why I was doing this. By early December, I was ready for the final act. I'd already transferred most of my personal items to Julianne's Malibu house. I'd recorded videos for my children to be played at my memorial service. I'd established a clear paper trail of declining health, culminating in a decision to stop treatment. All I needed now was to die. Faking a death certificate was the trickiest part, but not impossible with the right connections and enough money. Julianne had found a mortician willing to falsify cremation records. A doctor who owed her a favor signed the necessary documents, citing cardiac arrest secondary to metastatic cancer as the cause of death. On December 18th, 1 week before Christmas, Eleanor Montgomery officially ceased to exist. The news spread quickly through our social circle. Arrangements were made for a small memorial service on December 22nd, followed by a Christmas Eve celebration of life at our home, Richard's idea, supposedly to honor my love of the holiday. I knew better. It was Vivian's idea. She'd been circling for months, waiting for the moment she could claim her prize. Christmas Eve, when family and friends would be gathered, when the house would be at its most beautiful, was the perfect time to establish herself as the new lady of the estate. From my hidden room in the pool house, a space I'd renovated years ago as a private retreat, accessible through a concealed door in the storage closet, I watched the memorial service via security cameras I'd secretly installed. The turnout was impressive. Business associates, country club friends, my garden club ladies, all dressed in appropriately somber colors, murmuring about my courage, my dignity in the face of illness. Richard played the grieving widower perfectly, accepting condolences with a bowed head and trembling hands. Thomas stood stoically beside him, while Margaret wept openly, clutching the locket I'd given her, one that contained not a photo, but a tiny key. A key she didn't yet know would unlock the truth. And then there was Vivian. She sat 3 rows back, dressed in tasteful black, her blonde hair swept into a modest chignon. To anyone else, she appeared respectful, subdued. But I could see the gleam in her eyes, the slight lift at the corners of her mouth. She was already calculating, already planning. 2 days later, on Christmas Eve, my home transformed into a showcase of tasteful holiday elegance. Crystal, silver, and gold accents glittered under the chandeliers. The 12-foot Norwegian spruce in the great room, a tradition I'd maintained for 35 years, was adorned with the Montgomery family ornaments, some dating back 5 generations. From my hiding place, I watched Vivian arrive early, helping the caterers arrange platters, adjusting table settings I had selected, moving through my home as if she already owned it. She wore a deep green velvet dress that hugged her curves, her diamond earrings, gifts from Richard, no doubt, catching the light as she moved. My children arrived next. Margaret looked fragile, her eyes still red-rimmed from crying. Thomas appeared more composed, but the tightness around his mouth betrayed his tension. They moved awkwardly around Vivian, neither acknowledging nor rejecting her presence. Already, the power dynamics were shifting. By 8 o'clock, the house was filled with soft music and muted conversations. Friends and family reminisced about me over champagne and canapes. In the dining room, my best china and silver were arranged for a formal dinner, a dinner at my table with my crystal under my roof. I'd planned to wait until after the meal to make my entrance. But as I watched through the camera feed, something changed. Richard escorted Vivian to the head of the table, my place, and seated her with practiced gallantry. My children took their usual seats, their faces masks of painful politeness. Various cousins, friends, and Richard's business partners filled the remaining chairs. Richard tapped his glass, calling for attention. "Before we begin this meal," he said, his voice catching slightly, "I want to thank you all for being here." Eleanor loved Christmas. She loved this house filled with people with laughter. She would want us to celebrate, even in her absence. Murmurs of agreement rippled around the table. Margaret wiped a tear. Thomas stared stonily at his empty plate. And Richard continued, placing his hand over Vivian's. I want to thank Vivian for her support during these difficult months. Her presence has been a comfort I can't properly express. I felt my blood pressure rise as I watched Vivian lower her eyes modestly, squeezing Richard's hand in a show of solidarity. The absolute gall. The sheer, unbridled audacity. Then Vivian did something I hadn't anticipated. She stood, raising her champagne flute. I'd like to say something as well, she said, her voice honeyed with false humility. I never had the chance to know Eleanor as well as I would have liked. By all accounts, she was an extraordinary woman who created this beautiful home and raised 2 wonderful children. She smiled at Thomas and Margaret, who stared back with identical expressions of frozen politeness. I know I could never replace her, Vivian continued, casting her eyes downward before raising them again with practiced emotion. But I promise to honor her memory and her legacy in this house. A hushed silence fell over the table. Even Richard looked startled by her forwardness. My cousins exchanged glances. My gardening club friends shifted uncomfortably. Then Vivian raised her glass higher, her face transforming with a smile of triumph. So, here's to finally being the lady of the house. The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret's face crumpled. Thomas half rose from his chair, fury etched in every line of his face. Richard paled, reaching for Vivian's arm as if to pull her back into her seat. But it was too late. The mask had slipped. Everyone at that table now knew exactly who Vivian was and what she wanted. It was perfect. Better than I could have orchestrated myself. I'd planned a dramatic entrance, sweeping in from the main hallway, perhaps, or emerging from the shadows of the conservatory. But sometimes the universe provides a cue so perfect, so exquisitely timed, that it would be criminal not to seize it. I pressed the button that released the hidden door to the dining room, an architectural quirk dating back to Prohibition that I discovered during renovations and converted into a server's entrance. The door swung open silently behind Vivian as she stood there, glass raised, Victoria's smile still playing on her lips. I'm afraid, I said, stepping into the room. That position has already been filled. The crystal flute slipped from Vivian's fingers, shattering against the polished mahogany. Richard jerked to his feet so violently he upended his chair. Margaret screamed. Thomas froze, his expression cycling rapidly from shock to confusion to wild, disbelieving hope. Eleanor, Richard whispered, his face draining of color. I smiled, enjoying the perfect stillness of the moment, that crystallized second before chaos erupts. Merry Christmas, darling, I said. I hope you don't mind, but I've decided not to die after all. Vivian's face was a masterpiece of horror. Her perfect features contorted, her complexion ashen beneath her makeup. She swayed slightly, one hand gripping the back of her chair for support. This isn't possible, she breathed. You're dead. The funeral was lovely. I finished for her, though I thought the lilies were a bit much. They always did make me nauseated. Richard took a stumbling step toward me, then stopped, as if afraid I might vanish if he came too close. How? He began, unable to complete the thought. I moved further into the room, enjoying the dramatic effect of my appearance. I dressed carefully for the occasion in a deep crimson gown that complemented my newly restored figure. My hair, my real hair, which I'd never actually lost, was styled elegantly, and my makeup emphasized the healthy glow that had returned to my face. The how isn't important right now, I said, my gaze sweeping the stunned faces around the table. What matters is that I'm very much alive, and as Vivian so eloquently pointed out, I am still the lady of this house. Margaret was the first to break from her trance. With a sob, she launched herself from her chair and threw her arms around me. Mom, she cried, her body shaking. Mom, we all thought. I held her tightly, stroking her hair. I know, sweetheart. I'm so sorry for putting you through that. I'll explain everything, I promise. Thomas approached more cautiously, his lawyer's mind visibly working through the implications, the legalities, the sheer impossibility of what he was seeing. But when I opened my arm to include him, he too embraced me, his usual reserve crumbling. "You're really here," he murmured. "You're really okay." "I'm better than okay," I assured him. Over their shoulders, I watched Richard and Vivian. He remained frozen, his expression unreadable. She had recovered somewhat, her shock hardening into something more calculating. "This is some kind of sick joke," she said, her voice rising. "Or a trick. Look at her. Does she look like someone who was dying of cancer a week ago?" Several guests gasped at her crudeness. My cousin Elaine, never one to miss an opportunity for drama, crossed herself and whispered loudly, "It's a Christmas miracle." I gently disentangled myself from my children and addressed the table. "I apologize for the deception. As you can see, reports of my death were greatly exaggerated. I'm in perfect health, I always was. The reasons for my temporary departure are complicated and personal, but I assure you, everything will be explained in due time." I turned to our guests. "Please continue with dinner. Maria will set another place, for me, at the head of the table." Vivian took a step toward Richard, her hand clutching his arm. "Richard," she hissed, "say something." He looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, then back at me. 35 years of marriage hung in the balance of that look. 3.5 decades of shared history, 2 children, countless memories both bitter and sweet. "Eleanor," he said finally, his voice thick. "We need to talk." "Yes," I agreed. "We certainly do, but not tonight." I smiled at our assembled guests, who were watching the scene unfold with undisguised fascination. "Tonight is Christmas Eve, and I've always believed in honoring traditions. So let's eat, drink, and be merry. Tomorrow is soon enough for reckonings." Maria, bless her loyal heart, appeared with an extra place setting. She'd known of my plan from the beginning, had helped maintain the hidden apartment in the pool house, had slipped me updates about the household in my absence. Now she beamed as she set my place at the head of the table, deliberately displacing Vivian's setting to a less prominent position. "Mrs. Montgomery," she said loudly, "your usual seat." Vivian remained standing, her body rigid with fury. "This is insane," she spat. "All of you are acting like this is normal." She faked her own death. That's fraud. It's criminal." "Actually," Thomas said coolly, his legal mind clearly having processed the situation, "unless she filed false insurance claims or accepted benefits under false pretenses, it's not necessarily criminal to let people believe you're dead."
He looked at me.
"You didn't, did you, Mom?" "Of course not," I replied. "I would never do anything illegal. I simply took a sabbatical, during which certain people jumped to conclusions." Richard had not moved from his spot, seemingly paralyzed between his past and what he'd thought was his future. Vivian grabbed his arm again, her nails digging into his sleeve. "Richard, we're leaving," she announced. "This whole thing is—" "You're welcome to leave, Vivian," I interrupted smoothly. "Richard, of course, lives here. With me, his wife." The emphasis on wife sent a visible tremor through her. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across her perfect features. She looked at Richard, waiting for him to defend her, to choose her. But Richard Montgomery had always been, above all else, a pragmatist. And in that moment, with his supposedly dead wife returned to life, his stunned children watching, and a room full of witnesses, practicality won out over passion. "Vivian," he said quietly, "I think it's best if you go." The look she gave him could have curdled milk. Without another word, she snatched her purse from beside her chair and stormed from the room, her heels striking the marble foyer with sharp, angry clicks. The front door slammed with enough force to rattle the crystal on the table. An awkward silence fell, broken only when my cousin Elaine raised her glass. "Well," she declared, "this is certainly the most interesting Christmas Eve dinner I've ever attended." To Eleanor, back from the beyond, nervous laughter rippled around the table. Glasses were raised. The moment of highest tension had passed, dissolving into the surreal aftermath that follows any shocking event. Conversations resumed, though now in excited, speculative whispers. I took my seat at the head of the table, feeling the weight of Richard's stare. He had finally moved, taking his place at the opposite end, 30 feet of polished mahogany between us. Our children flanked me, still touching my arms occasionally, as if to reassure themselves I was solid, real. Tomorrow, I said quietly to them, I'll explain everything, including what happens next. Thomas nodded, his expression grim but determined. Margaret squeezed my hand, her eyes still wet but now gleaming with something that looked almost like admiration. The meal proceeded with a strained semblance of normalcy. I ate little, too keyed up from the confrontation and too aware that the real battle was yet to come. Across the table, Richard drank too much, his movements becoming less precise, his gaze never leaving my face. By 11, most of our guests had departed, still buzzing with the evening's drama. I knew the story would be all over town by morning. Eleanor Montgomery, risen from the grave to reclaim her life. It would be the scandal of the decade. I didn't care. Let them talk. Let them speculate. The truth was far more satisfying than any gossip they could invent. As the last guests left, Richard, Thomas, Margaret, and I stood in the foyer, a tableau of family dysfunction in holiday finery. I assume you'll be sleeping in the guest room, I said to Richard, my voice pleasant but firm. He nodded once, defeated and deflated, the brief fire of his earlier shock extinguished by alcohol and exhaustion. Without a word, he turned and climbed the stairs, suddenly looking every one of his 63 years. Thomas cleared his throat. Mom, are you sure you're okay? This is a lot. I'm fine, I assured him. Better than I've been in years, actually. But why? Margaret pressed. Why let us think you were dying? Do you know what that did to us? I touched her cheek gently. I know, sweetheart. And I'm truly sorry for the pain I caused you. But I had my reasons. Good ones. And tomorrow, at the lawyer's office, you'll understand everything. The lawyer's office? Thomas frowned. What's happening tomorrow? I smiled, the first genuine smile I'd felt in months. Justice, I said simply. Justice is happening tomorrow. That night, I slept in my own bed for the first time in weeks. The sheets were fresh, the pillows plumped, Maria's doing, no doubt. Through the wall, I could hear Richard moving restlessly in the guest room, the occasional clink of ice in a glass suggesting he was continuing his evening's drinking. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, mentally preparing for the next phase of my plan. The reappearance had gone perfectly, better than I'd dared hope. Vivian had shown her true colors in front of everyone who mattered. Richard had revealed his weakness, his inability to stand firm in the face of social pressure. But tomorrow would be the true test. Tomorrow at Wilson and Associates, when the paperwork was revealed, when the full extent of my preparation became clear. I closed my eyes, imagining Vivian's face when she learned the truth. How it would drain of color, how those perfect lips would part in shock. How she would realize, too late, that she had never been playing chess with Richard. She'd been playing with me. And I had just called checkmate. As I drifted toward sleep, my phone buzzed with a text message. I checked it, expecting perhaps a message from one of my children. Instead, it was from an unknown number. This isn't over. I smiled into the darkness. Of course it wasn't over. It was just beginning. The next morning, Christmas Day, dawned clear and cold. I rose early, dressing with particular care in a tailored black suit that emphasized my restored figure. Downstairs, I found Thomas already at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee and looking as if he hadn't slept. Merry Christmas, I said, pouring myself a cup. He looked up, still visibly processing the reality of my presence. Mom, he started then stopped, seeming unsure how to continue. Last night, it wasn't a dream, was it? Not unless we're having the same one, I replied, sitting across from him. He rubbed his face. I have about 1,000 questions, and I'll answer them, I promised. But first, I need to know, are you with me? No matter what happens today. Thomas studied me, his lawyer's eyes assessing, measuring. Then he nodded once, decisive. Always. Margaret joined us shortly after, her expression more openly emotional than her brother's. She hugged me fiercely before sitting down. "Where's Dad?" she asked, glancing around as if Richard might materialize from behind the refrigerator. "Still sleeping, I imagine," I said. He had quite a night. We shared a quiet Christmas morning coffee, the conversation carefully avoiding the elephant in the room. Instead, we spoke of small things: Margaret's latest exhibition, Thomas's new apartment, the unseasonably warm weather we'd been having. It was almost noon when Richard finally appeared, unshaven and hollow-eyed. He stopped short in the doorway when he saw us, as if surprised to find me still corporeal, still present. "Merry Christmas," I said pleasantly. "Coffee." He shook his head, moving stiffly to the counter to pour himself a glass of water. "What time is the meeting at Wilson's?" he asked, his voice rough. 3:00, I replied. Wilson agreed to open the office as a special favor, given the unusual circumstances. Richard nodded dully. In the harsh morning light, he looked beaten, resigned. Part of me, a small, still tender part, felt a pang of sympathy. But I crushed it ruthlessly. He had made his choices. Now he would live with the consequences. "Will Vivian be there?" Margaret asked, a hint of her anger finally showing through. "Oh, yes," I said, sipping my coffee. I made sure of it. At 2:45, we gathered in the foyer, ready to depart for the law office. I had insisted we all ride together, a final family outing of sorts. Richard opened his mouth as if to protest, then closed it again, acquiescing without a fight. Whatever fire had once animated him seemed extinguished, replaced by a dull acceptance of whatever was to come. The drive to Wilson and Associates was silent, the festive Christmas decorations along Main Street a surreal backdrop to the tension in our car. I sat in the front passenger seat, Thomas drove, and Margaret and Richard occupied the back, as far from each other as the confines of the vehicle would allow. Wilson's office was in an old converted townhouse downtown, its brick facade adorned with a discreet brass plaque. As we approached, I saw a familiar figure pacing on the sidewalk out front, her blonde hair whipping in the winter wind. Vivian spotted our car and froze, her expression hardening. She wore a camel-colored coat over what appeared to be the same green dress from the night before, suggesting she'd had little time to prepare for this meeting. "Good." I wanted her off balance. "Remember," I said quietly as Thomas parked the car, "no matter what happens in there, we're still a family. We present a united front." Margaret nodded firmly. Thomas set his jaw in determination. Richard stared straight ahead, saying nothing. We exited the car as one, approaching Vivian with measured steps. She stood her ground, chin raised defiantly. "I hope you're ready to explain yourself," she spat at me. "Faking your death? Do you have any idea how sick that is?" "Almost as sick as sleeping with another woman's husband," Margaret muttered. Vivian's eyes flashed. "Stay out of this, little girl. This is between the adults." "Actually," I interjected smoothly, "this concerns all of us. Shall we go inside? Mr. Wilson is waiting." Without waiting for a response, I climbed the steps to the office door. The others followed, Richard reluctantly, Thomas and Margaret protectively flanking me, Vivian stalking behind like a predator denied its kill. Wilson greeted us in the reception area, his usual courtroom poker face betraying a hint of curiosity. He was an old-school attorney who had handled the Montgomery family affairs for decades, first for Richard's parents and then for us. "Mrs. Montgomery," he said, taking my hand. "I must say, this is the most unusual Christmas Day meeting I've ever had the pleasure of conducting." "Thank you for accommodating us, James," I replied warmly. "I know it's an imposition." "Not at all." His eyes slid to Vivian. "And you must be Miss Carter. I don't believe we've had the pleasure." Vivian ignored his extended hand. "Let's get on with this," she said tersely. "I have places to be." Wilson's eyebrows rose slightly, but he maintained his professional demeanor. "Of course. Please, follow me to the conference room." We filed in, taking seats around the large mahogany table. Wilson positioned himself at the head, opposite me, and opened a leather portfolio. "Before we begin," he said, "I want to confirm that everyone understands why we're here." Mrs. Montgomery has asked me to clarify certain legal matters pertaining to the Montgomery estate, particularly in light of recent developments." "You mean her miraculous resurrection?" Vivian said sarcastically. Wilson's expression didn't change. "Indeed. Now, Mrs. Montgomery, would you like me to proceed with the explanation?" I leaned forward, resting my clasped hands on the table. "Actually, James, I'd like to say a few words first." I turned to face Richard directly. For the first time since my return, I allowed myself to really look at him, the man I had loved for 35 years, the father of my children, my partner in building a life I had once believed unshakable. "Richard," I began, my voice steady. "When I discovered your affair with Vivian, I was devastated. Not just by the betrayal, but by the realization that you thought so little of me that you believed I wouldn't find out. That I would simply fade away, conveniently making room for your new life." He flinched but said nothing. "Then, when I received my diagnosis—" "What diagnosis?" Thomas interrupted. "Mom, you said the cancer was a lie." I smiled sadly. The terminal part was a lie. The initial finding wasn't. I did have a small tumor, early stage, highly treatable. But when the doctor called, something in me shifted. I realized I had a choice. I could fight for my life, a life with a husband who no longer wanted me, or I could use the situation to my advantage. "So you pretended to die," Vivian said flatly. "To what end? To humiliate Richard? To punish me?" "To protect what's mine," I corrected her. "My home, my legacy, my dignity." I nodded to Wilson, who removed several documents from his portfolio. "This," Wilson said, sliding the first document across the table, "is the deed to the Montgomery estate. As you can see, it was transferred solely into Eleanor's name 8 years ago when Montgomery Industries faced potential bankruptcy." Richard shifted uncomfortably. 8 years earlier, his company had overextended on a risky venture that nearly collapsed. To protect our family home from creditors, he had signed everything over to me. It was meant to be temporary, but as his business recovered, neither of us had seen any reason to change the arrangement. "So what?" Vivian scoffed. "They're married. What's hers is his." Wilson's lips twitched in what might have been amusement. "Not exactly, Ms. Carter. New York is not a community property state. Assets held separately remain separate, even in marriage." He slid another document forward. "This is Mrs. Montgomery's will, her real will, not the one prepared as part of her strategic absence. As you can see, in the event of her death, the estate would pass directly into a trust benefiting her children and eventual grandchildren. Mr. Montgomery would retain lifetime residency rights, but no ownership interest and no power to transfer or sell the property." The color drained from Vivian's face. "That can't be legal." "I assure you, it is entirely legal," Wilson replied. "Mrs. Montgomery consulted me extensively on these arrangements several months ago." "Several months." Richard spoke for the first time, his voice barely audible. "You've been planning this for months?" I met his gaze steadily. "Since the night I found your text messages to Vivian. The ones where you discussed how convenient it would be when the old bag finally kicks it and you could start fresh in the house I spent 30 years restoring." Margaret gasped. Thomas cursed under his breath. Richard paled. "Eleanor, those texts, they were taken out of context. Vivian was joking, being dramatic. I never..." "Never what?" I asked softly. "Never meant for me to find out? Never intended to move her into my home the moment I was gone? Because from where I'm sitting, that's exactly what happened." "This is absurd," Vivian cut in, her composure cracking. "Richard, tell them this is ridiculous. The house is as much yours as hers. You paid for it." "Actually," Wilson interjected, "the original purchase was jointly financed, but Mrs. Montgomery's inheritance from her grandmother funded approximately 70% of the renovation costs over the years. Furthermore, she has been the sole owner of record for 8 years, paying all property taxes and maintenance costs from her personal accounts." He slid a third document across the table. "This is the current deed, recorded yesterday upon confirmation of Mrs. Montgomery's continued existence. As you can see, her ownership remains intact and uncontested. Vivian snatched the paper, her eyes scanning it frantically. This can't be. She turned to Richard, her voice rising. You told me the house would be ours. You promised. Richard seemed to shrink in his chair. I thought it would be, he mumbled. I didn't know about the trust. You didn't know because you never bothered to ask, I said evenly. You assumed, as you've always assumed, that things would simply fall into place according to your wishes. I turned to Wilson. James, would you please explain the final arrangement? Wilson nodded, removing one last document from his portfolio. This is a separation agreement, prepared at Mrs. Montgomery's request. It outlines terms for Mr. Montgomery's departure from the estate, division of personal property, and initial support arrangements pending a formal divorce settlement. The word divorce hung in the air like a thunderclap. Richard stared at the document, then at me, genuine shock registering on his face for the first time. Eleanor, he began, his voice trembling slightly. Surely we can discuss this. After 35 years. 35 years, I repeated, cutting him off. 35 years, Richard. That's how long I gave you. That's how much of my life I invested in our marriage, our home, our family. And you were willing to throw it all away for... I glanced dismissively at Vivian. For this. Vivian shot to her feet, her face contorted with fury. You smug, manipulative bitch. You think you've won? You think this little performance changes anything? Miss Carter, Wilson cautioned, I must ask you to moderate your language or leave the meeting. She ignored him, leaning across the table toward me. You faked a terminal illness. You let your children believe their mother was dying. What kind of monster does that? The kind who protects what matters, I replied calmly. My children will forgive me because they understand what was at stake. Can you say the same about your actions? My actions, she sputtered. I fell in love. That's not a crime. No, I agreed. But it is a miscalculation when you fall in love with a married man and assume his wife will conveniently disappear. I smiled thinly. I'm afraid I've never been convenient, Vivian. Just ask Richard. Richard had gone completely still, his eyes fixed on the separation agreement. The house, he said finally, looking up at me. You're taking the house. The house is already mine. I corrected him. I'm simply maintaining possession of what legally belongs to me. Where am I supposed to go? He asked, a note of genuine panic in his voice. Before I could answer, Vivian laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. Oh, this is rich. The great Richard Montgomery brought low. Don't worry, darling. You can stay with me in my little apartment. It's only 1,000 square feet, but we'll make do, won't we? The look of pure horror on Richard's face was almost comical. He had never lived anywhere but the most luxurious accommodations. The thought of a modest apartment clearly terrified him more than the prospect of divorce. Actually, I said, the agreement includes a provision for Richard to receive sufficient funds to secure appropriate housing. I'm not interested in destitution, only justice. How generous, Vivian spat. Thomas, who had been silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke. I think we've heard enough. Dad, I hope you'll sign the agreement without making this more difficult than it needs to be. Richard looked at his son, then at Margaret, seeking any sign of support. Finding none, his shoulders slumped in defeat. May I have some time to review the terms? He asked Wilson. Of course, Wilson replied. You're entitled to independent legal counsel. However, I should mention that Mrs. Montgomery has been more than fair in her proposed settlement. My advice, speaking frankly, would be to accept it. Richard nodded dully. And if I don't? I leaned forward. Then we go to court, Richard, where I will be forced to detail your infidelity, your gaslighting, your emotional abandonment. Where our friends, our colleagues, our social circle will hear every sordid detail of your relationship with Vivian. Where your business associates will learn how you plotted to move your mistress into your wife's home before her body was even cold. I paused, letting the implications sink in. Is that really what you want? The threat of public humiliation, the one thing Richard had always feared most, hung in the air between us. His reputation, his standing in the community, his carefully cultivated image as a respected businessman and family man, all of it balanced on the edge of a knife. "I'll sign," he said finally, his voice barely audible. Vivian stared at him in disbelief. "Richard, you can't be serious. This is blackmail." "No," Wilson corrected her mildly. "This is a private settlement offer, entirely legal and quite generous under the circumstances." Richard reached for the pen Wilson offered, his hand trembling slightly. He signed his name on the indicated line, then pushed the document away as if it burned his fingers. "There," he said hollowly. "It's done." I felt no triumph in that moment, only a profound sense of closure. The man I had loved, the man I had built a life with, was a stranger to me now. A weak, frightened stranger who had betrayed everything we'd created together. "The agreement specifies that you have 2 weeks to remove your personal belongings from the property," Wilson informed Richard. "Mrs. Montgomery has graciously arranged for a suite at the Westchester Grand until you secure permanent accommodations." 2 weeks, Richard echoed. "To pack up 35 years. "More than enough time for what you're entitled to take," I replied. "The household inventory is quite specific." Vivian made a sound of pure frustration. "This isn't over," she hissed, echoing her text message from the night before. "You think you've won, but you have no idea what's coming." I regarded her calmly. "Is that a threat, Vivian?" "It's a promise," she snapped, grabbing her purse. "Richard, are you coming or not?" Richard looked at her, then at me, then at our children. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of the man I had married, the thoughtful, deliberate man who had once promised to cherish me until death parted us. But then his expression hardened, and he stood. "I'll be at the hotel," he said to no one in particular. "Thomas, Margaret." "I'm sorry." "For what, Dad?" Margaret asked, her voice cracking. "For cheating on Mom? For lying to all of us? For making plans to move your girlfriend into our family home while Mom was supposedly dying?" Richard had no answer. Without another word, he followed Vivian from the room, leaving a heavy silence in his wake. Wilson cleared his throat. "Well, Mrs. Montgomery, I believe that concludes our business for today. Unless there's anything else?" I shook my head.
"No, James."
"Thank you for your time, especially on Christmas Day." "My pleasure," he replied, gathering his documents. "And may I say, it's good to see you looking so well." A smile tugged at my lips. Yes, I'm feeling quite revitalized. After Wilson escorted us out, Thomas, Margaret, and I stood on the sidewalk in the fading winter light. The streets were mostly empty, with families tucked away in their homes celebrating Christmas. "Well," Thomas said after a moment, "that was intense." Margaret laughed, a slightly hysterical edge to the sound. "That's one word for it." She turned to me. "Mom, I can't believe you pulled this off. It's like something from a movie." "Sometimes," I told her, "life requires a dramatic gesture." "Are you okay?" Thomas asked, studying my face. "Really okay?" "Because what Dad did, what they both did." "I'm better than okay," I assured him. "For the first time in years, I feel free."
And it was true.
The weight that had pressed on me throughout my marriage, the constant effort to be perfect, to maintain appearances, to ignore the growing distance between Richard and me, had lifted. In its place was a lightness, a sense of possibility I hadn't felt since my 20s. "Let's go home," I suggested. "We still have Christmas dinner to prepare." "Just the 3 of us?" Margaret asked. I smiled. The 3 of us. The way it should be. We drove back to the estate, my estate, in comfortable silence. As we turned up the long driveway, the house came into view, its windows glowing warm against the gathering dusk. Christmas lights twinkled along the roofline and wrapped around the columns of the front porch. All my doing, all part of traditions I had maintained for decades. For the first time, I saw it truly as mine. Not as the Montgomery family home, not as the showcase property Richard had purchased to impress his business associates, but as my creation, my sanctuary. "It's beautiful," Margaret said softly, following my gaze. It's always been beautiful, but now it's yours, Thomas finished. Free and clear. I nodded, feeling a surge of emotion.
Yes.
Finally, inside, the remnants of last night's interrupted celebration still lingered. Half-empty glasses, discarded napkins, the enormous Christmas tree still glittering in the great room. Maria had clearly tried to tidy up, but had left the major cleaning for after the holiday. I'll start on dinner, Margaret offered, heading toward the kitchen. I think we all need comfort food tonight. I'll help, Thomas added, following her. I moved through the main rooms, straightening decorations, gathering abandoned glasses, reconnecting with my home. In the dining room, I paused, looking at the chair where Vivian had stood, champagne glass raised, declaring herself the lady of the house. The audacity still took my breath away. Upstairs, I noticed Richard's bedroom door ajar. Curious, I pushed it open to find the closet doors flung wide, hangers empty, drawers pulled out. He had wasted no time collecting his essentials.
Good.
The sooner he removed himself from my space, the better. Back downstairs, I found my children in the kitchen, working in tandem as they had since they were teenagers. Margaret was preparing a salad while Thomas basted a small roast chicken, a far cry from the elaborate Christmas dinner we usually enjoyed, but perfect for our reduced party. Need any help? I asked, leaning against the doorframe. They looked up, identical expressions of affection on their faces. Just sit, Margaret instructed, pointing to a stool at the island. You've done enough plotting and scheming for one day. I laughed, taking the indicated seat. Fair enough. Thomas opened a bottle of wine, pouring 3 glasses. To Mom, he said, raising his. The most badass woman I know. Margaret clinked her glass against his. Here. I sipped my wine, watching them work, feeling a contentment I hadn't experienced in years. We had survived. We had prevailed. The future stretched before us, uncertain but full of possibility. Later, as we sat around the kitchen table enjoying our impromptu Christmas dinner, Margaret asked the question I'd been anticipating. Mom, what will you do now? With the house, with your life? I considered the question. What would I do? For so long, my identity had been wrapped up in being Richard Montgomery's wife, the perfect hostess, the flawless society matron. Now I was simply Eleanor, still wealthy, still privileged, but untethered from the role I'd played for 3.5 decades. I'm not sure yet, I admitted. Travel, perhaps. I've always wanted to see more of the world. Redecorate. This place could use some updating. And spend more time with you both, of course. You could date, Thomas suggested, a mischievous glint in his eye. Imagine Dad's face if you showed up at the country club with someone new. The thought made me laugh. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. The divorce isn't even filed yet. Speaking of which, Margaret said, what do you think Vivian meant when she said this isn't over? Should we be worried? I shrugged, affecting more confidence than I felt. Empty threats. What can she possibly do? The house is mine, the separation agreement is signed, and I have you 2 on my side. She's lost. Unless she convinces Dad to fight the divorce, Thomas pointed out. He seemed pretty shocked by the whole thing. He won't, I said firmly. Richard hates conflict, especially public conflict. And he knows I have enough evidence of his affair to make any divorce proceedings very uncomfortable for him. No, he'll take the path of least resistance, as he always has. Margaret looked unconvinced. I don't know, Mom. She seems unstable. The way she looked at you in Wilson's office was scary. I'm not afraid of Vivian Carter, I declared, refilling our wine glasses. She's a desperate woman who just watched her meal ticket evaporate. She'll move on to greener pastures soon enough. If only I had known then how wrong I was. If only I had taken Margaret's concerns more seriously. But I was flush with victory, buoyed by the success of my plan, blind to the danger that was already coiling like a snake, waiting to strike. The following week passed in a blur of activity. News of my miraculous recovery spread through town like wildfire, each retelling more elaborate than the last. According to the gossip mill, I had been the victim of a rare disease, experimental treatment, divine intervention, or some combination of all three. I let the rumors swirl. The truth, that I had faked my illness and death to expose my husband's betrayal and secure my home, was far more scandalous than any tale they could invent. Richard moved the last of his belongings out 3 days after Christmas, arriving with a rental truck and 2 movers while I was conveniently out having lunch with Julianne, who had flown in from California to support me. By the time I returned, all traces of his presence had been removed from the main areas of the house. All that remained was his study, a wood-paneled room at the back of the house that had been his exclusive domain throughout our marriage. The door was locked when I tried it, with a note taped to the wood. "We'll clear out this weekend. RM." I left it untouched. Let him have a few more days of denial. On New Year's Eve, Thomas and Margaret both had plans with friends, leaving me alone in the house for the first time since my return. I considered throwing an impromptu party. What better way to cement my resurrection than to host a celebration, but decided against it. I wasn't quite ready to face the inevitable questions, the curious stares, the thinly veiled judgment of our social circle. Instead, I opened a bottle of champagne and settled in the conservatory, my favorite room in the house. The glass walls and ceiling offered a perfect view of the winter stars, and the heated floor kept the space warm despite the frigid night outside. As midnight approached, my phone chimed with a text from Thomas. "Happy New Year, Mom. Love you." A moment later, Margaret sent a similar message, along with a selfie showing her and her friends, champagne glasses raised. I smiled, typing responses to both. My children were the one unequivocal success of my marriage to Richard. Whatever else had gone wrong, we had raised 2 remarkable human beings. At midnight exactly, the doorbell rang. I frowned, setting aside my champagne. Who would be calling at this hour, on this night? Thomas and Margaret both had keys, and no one else would. A chill ran down my spine as I remembered Vivian's parting words. "This isn't over." Cautiously, I approached the front door, peering through the sidelight. The porch appeared empty, but a large package sat on the welcome mat, a box wrapped in glossy red paper with a black ribbon. A New Year's gift? From whom? I hesitated, then chided myself for being paranoid. It was probably just a late delivery, or perhaps a peace offering from Richard. I opened the door and brought the package inside, noting its substantial weight. No card was attached, no indication of its sender. In the living room, I placed it on the coffee table and carefully untied the ribbon. The wrapping paper fell away to reveal a plain white box. I lifted the lid and froze, my blood turning to ice in my veins. Inside was a doll crafted to look exactly like me, down to the details of my favorite blue dress and pearl earrings. But the doll's neck was broken, the head lolling at a grotesque angle. Its face was painted with an expression of terror, and a miniature knife protruded from its chest. Beneath the doll lay a card, written in a familiar hand. "Next time, it won't be a doll." I dropped the box as if it had burned me, my heart pounding. The threat was unmistakable, the message clear. Vivian was not finished with me. Not by a long shot. My first instinct was to call the police, but I hesitated. What could I tell them? That my husband's mistress had sent me a threatening doll? They would view it as a tasteless prank, nothing more. And without proof that Vivian had sent it. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to think rationally. This was intimidation, nothing more. Vivian wanted me frightened, off balance. She wanted me to know she was still a threat. Well, 2 could play that game. I picked up my phone and dialed Wilson's number, not caring about the late hour or the holiday. "James," I said when he answered, sounding surprisingly alert for midnight on New Year's Eve. "I need your help. There's been a development." The next morning, New Year's Day, 2023, I sat in Wilson's office, the doll and its accompanying note laid out on his desk. "This is disturbing," he admitted, examining the doll without touching it. "But unfortunately, not explicitly illegal. It's threatening, certainly, but vague enough that law enforcement would likely view it as a distasteful prank rather than a credible threat." "So, I'm supposed to just ignore it?" I asked, incredulous. "Not at all," Wilson replied. I suggest we document everything, photograph the doll, the note, the packaging. Start a record of any contact or threats from Miss Carter. If this escalates, we'll have evidence of a pattern of harassment. And in the meantime, he hesitated. Have you considered additional security? Perhaps a system for the house, maybe even a personal bodyguard until this situation resolves. The suggestion seemed extreme, but the doll's grotesque face flashed in my mind. I'll look into it, I promised. Good. And Eleanor? Wilson leaned forward, his expression grave. Be careful. Hell hath no fury like a woman who's lost her meal ticket. I smiled thinly. I'm familiar with fury, James. I've been nursing my own for quite some time. Over the next few weeks, I implemented Wilson's suggestions. I had a state-of-the-art security system installed in the house, complete with cameras covering every entrance and much of the grounds. I hired a former police officer as a part-time security consultant who advised on additional measures and checked in regularly. I also contacted a private investigator recommended by Wilson, a discreet, efficient woman named Renata Vasquez who specialized in surveillance and background checks. I want to know everything about Vivian Carter, I told her during our initial meeting in a coffee shop 20 miles from my home. Where she came from, her financial situation, her movements, her contacts with my husband. Everything. Renata nodded, making notes. Any particular areas of interest? I thought for a moment. Her past relationships. I want to know if there's a pattern here, if Richard is the first married man she's targeted, or if this is her modus operandi. Understood. And your budget? Unlimited, I said simply. Whatever it takes. Renata raised an eyebrow but didn't comment. I'll need a retainer to start. I wrote her a check on the spot. Find me something I can use, Ms. Vasquez. Something that will make Vivian Carter regret the day she ever heard the name Montgomery. January crawled by, cold and gray. Richard made no attempt to contact me except through his newly hired attorney, who sent increasingly aggressive letters questioning various aspects of the separation agreement. I forwarded them all to Wilson, who handled them with his usual calm efficiency. Vivian, meanwhile, maintained a disconcerting silence. No more dolls, no more threatening notes. Nothing. The lack of contact was almost more unnerving than the original threat. My children checked in regularly, clearly worried about me despite my reassurances. Thomas had returned to his law practice in the city, but Margaret had extended her holiday visit, staying in her old room under the pretense of working remotely on her museum catalog. I knew she was really staying to keep an eye on me, but I welcomed her presence. The house felt too empty, too quiet without her. On a particularly dreary Tuesday in late January, Renata called with her preliminary findings. I've got something, she said without preamble. Can you meet? We arranged to meet at the same out-of-the-way coffee shop. Renata arrived with a thick manila folder, which she placed on the table between us. Vivian Carter, she began, is not who she claims to be. I leaned forward, intrigued. Go on. For starters, her name isn't Vivian Carter. It's Victoria Caruso. She changed it legally 8 years ago, when she moved to New York from Chicago. Why the change? Renata's expression was grim. Because in Chicago, Victoria Caruso was known for something other than her executive assistant skills. She slid a newspaper clipping across the table. She was the prime suspect in the death of her fiancé, real estate developer Harold Whitman. I stared at the grainy photo accompanying the article. A younger Vivian, Victoria, was being escorted from a luxury apartment building by police officers, her face partly obscured but still recognizable. She killed her fiancé? I whispered, stunned. Allegedly, Renata corrected. Charges were never filed due to insufficient evidence. Whitman drowned in his bathtub after a night of heavy drinking. The medical examiner ruled it accidental, but Whitman's family insisted Victoria had something to do with it. She was the sole beneficiary of his life insurance policy, a policy he'd changed just 2 months before his death. I felt a chill run through me. And she collected on this policy? $1.5 million, Renata confirmed. She disappeared from Chicago shortly after, resurfacing in New York with a new name, a new look, and a clean record. I leafed through the rest of the folder, my heart racing. Police reports, financial records, employment history. Renata had been thorough. "There's more," she said, tapping a document near the bottom of the stack. Before Whitman, there was another man, Gregory Parsons, a divorced hedge fund manager in his 50s. She was his personal assistant. They were romantically involved for about a year before he died of an apparent heart attack. Again, she was named in his will, though this time the family successfully contested it. "A pattern," I murmured. "She targets wealthy older men, works her way into their lives, and then they die," Renata finished bluntly. "I can't prove she killed anyone, Mrs. Montgomery, but the circumstantial evidence is concerning." I sat back, processing this information. Victoria, wasn't just a gold digger. She was potentially a killer, and she had targeted my husband, would have moved into my home after my death. Had she somehow known about my initial diagnosis? Had she been waiting, hoping it would worsen, planning to step into my shoes once I was gone? Or worse, had she been planning to help nature along? "What about her current whereabouts?" I asked. "Is she still seeing Richard?" Renata nodded. "They're living together in the suite at the Westchester Grand. According to my sources, they've been looking at apartments in the city, but haven't settled on anything yet." "And has she shown any unusual interest in me? Any signs she's planning something?" "Nothing overt," Renata replied. "But she's been making some interesting phone calls. To private investigators of her own, for one thing. And to a lawyer who specializes in contesting wills and trusts." I frowned. "But I'm not dead. There's no will to contest." "No," Renata agreed. "But there is the matter of the house, which she clearly had her sights set on. From what I've gathered, she's pressuring Richard to fight for a share of the property in the divorce." "He won't win," I said confidently. "The legal situation is clear." "Maybe," Renata said, her expression cautious. "But legal battles can be expensive and draining, even when you're in the right. And from what I've seen of Victoria Caruso, she doesn't give up easily when there's money involved." I gathered the documents, my mind working rapidly. Is there enough here to take to the police? To have her investigated for her previous activities? Renata shook her head. "The Chicago case is closed. Officially, Whitman's death was an accident. Without new evidence, they won't reopen it. And Parsons' death was ruled natural causes. There wasn't even an investigation. So we have knowledge, but no leverage," I summarized. "Not yet," Renata corrected. "I'm still digging. There's more to find, I'm sure of it. People like Victoria Caruso always leave tracks, if you know where to look." I nodded, a plan already forming in my mind. "Keep looking. And add one more thing to your search. I want to know about any unusual financial transactions between Richard and Vivian. Gifts, transfers, joint accounts. Anything that might suggest she's already got her hooks into his money." "Will do," Renata promised. "And, Mrs. Montgomery, be careful. If my suspicions are correct, you're dealing with someone truly dangerous, someone who's gotten away with murder. Twice." As I drove home, the manila folder secure in my handbag, a strange calm settled over me. The threat was real, more real than I had imagined. But now I had information, ammunition in a war I hadn't fully understood until today. Vivian Carter, Victoria Caruso, had chosen the wrong opponent. She thought she was dealing with a soft society wife, easily outmaneuvered, easily eliminated. She was about to learn how wrong she was. When I arrived home, I found Margaret in the kitchen, preparing dinner. The normalcy of the scene, my daughter chopping vegetables at the counter, music playing softly in the background, struck a discordant note against the dark knowledge I now possessed. "Everything okay, Mom?" Margaret asked, noticing my expression. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Just tired," I lied, setting my bag on the counter. "Long day of errands." She didn't look convinced, but didn't press the issue. "I'm making that pasta you like. Should be ready in about 20 minutes. "Sounds perfect," I said, forcing a smile. "I'll just go freshen up." Upstairs in my bedroom, I locked the door and spread Renata's documents across the bed. Page after page of Vivian's, Victoria's, dark history. The suspicious deaths, the insurance payouts, the name change, the calculated reinvention. And now she had set her sights on Richard. On my house. On my life. A shiver ran through me as I recalled the broken doll, its head lolling at that sickening angle. It wasn't just a threat. It was a promise from a woman who had likely killed before and gotten away with it. I gathered the papers and secured them in my personal safe, hidden behind a false panel in my closet. Then, I did something I'd been avoiding for weeks. I called Richard. He answered on the third ring, his voice wary. "Eleanor, we need to talk," I said without preamble. "Not over the phone. In person. If this is about the house again, it's not about the house." I cut him off. "It's about Vivian. And your safety." There was a long pause. "My safety," he repeated, a note of disbelief in his voice. "Richard, please. This is important. Meet me tomorrow at the Botanical Gardens by the Japanese Pavilion. Noon." Another pause. "Eleanor, if this is some kind of—" "It's not a trick," I assured him. "It's not a ploy. It's life or death, Richard. I'm not exaggerating." Something in my voice must have convinced him. "All right," he said finally. "Tomorrow at noon." I ended the call, my heart pounding. Warning Richard felt like a betrayal of myself, of all I had suffered at his hands. But I couldn't let him walk blindly into danger, no matter how much he had hurt me. Because despite everything, there had been 35 years. Despite everything, he was still the father of my children. Despite everything, I didn't want his blood on my hands, even indirectly. The next day dawned cold and clear, the kind of crisp winter day that makes the air feel like crystal. I dressed carefully in a cashmere sweater and wool slacks, topped with my warmest coat. The botanical gardens would be frigid this time of year, but they offered what I needed most: privacy, neutral ground, and plenty of open space where no one could approach unnoticed. I arrived early, walking the empty paths with their dormant flower beds and skeletal trees. The Japanese pavilion sat on a small island in the center of a frozen pond, accessible by an arched wooden bridge. It was one of my favorite spots in spring and summer, peaceful and secluded. Now, in winter, it was practically deserted. Perfect for a conversation no one else should hear. Richard arrived precisely at noon, looking thinner than when I'd last seen him, his face drawn with new lines of stress. He wore an expensive overcoat that couldn't quite disguise the slump in his shoulders, the diminishment in his once commanding presence. "Eleanor," he greeted me stiffly, stopping several feet away as if afraid to come closer. "Thank you for coming," I said, gesturing to the bench beside me. "Please sit." He hesitated, then lowered himself onto the bench, maintaining as much distance between us as the small space allowed. "You said this was about Vivian," he prompted. "About my safety." I nodded, suddenly uncertain how to begin. How do you tell someone that the woman they're living with might be a killer? That they might be her next victim? "Richard," I started. "What do you know about Vivian's past? Before she came to work for you?" He frowned. "What does that have to do with anything? Just answer the question, please." He shrugged. "Not much, I suppose. She grew up in the Midwest, Illinois, I think." "Chicago," I corrected. "She grew up in Chicago, where she was known as Victoria Caruso." Richard's expression shifted from irritation to confusion. "What are you talking about? Her name has always been Vivian Carter." I pulled a folder from my purse, copies of the most crucial documents from Renata's file. "No, Richard, it hasn't. She legally changed her name 8 years ago after leaving Chicago under suspicious circumstances." "This is ridiculous," he scoffed, but made no move to take the folder. "Whatever game you're playing, this isn't a game." I opened the folder and removed the newspaper clipping about Harold Whitman's death. Did she ever mention her fiancé, who drowned in his bathtub? Or the life insurance policy she collected on? $1.5 million, Richard. That's what she got when he died. Richard stared at the clipping, his face paling. This could be anyone. The photo is blurry." "It's her," I insisted. "And he wasn't the first. Before him, there was Gregory Parsons, a hedge fund manager she worked for. Heart attack, very convenient. She was named in his will, too." I laid out more documents, police reports, financial records, employment history. She has a pattern, Richard. She targets wealthy men, works her way into their lives, and then they die under questionable circumstances. And she profits. Richard's hands trembled slightly as he finally picked up one of the reports. Why are you showing me this? What do you hope to accomplish? I'm trying to save your life, I said bluntly. Victoria, whatever she calls herself, she's dangerous. And now she's living with you, isolated you from your family, and is pushing you to fight for assets that aren't legally yours. Don't you see the pattern? He was silent for a long moment, his eyes scanning the documents spread between us. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. She's been asking about my will, about my life insurance. A chill ran through me despite the winter sun. And have you changed either to include her? He wouldn't meet my eyes. The insurance. Not the will, not yet. She's been insistent about financial security. Given the separation, I thought it was reasonable. Richard, I said, forcing myself to remain calm. You need to undo that change immediately.
Today.
And you need to get away from her. It's not that simple, he protested. We're living together. We have plans. Plans that involve my house? I asked sharply. Is that why your lawyer has been sending increasingly aggressive letters about the property? Because Vivian wants it. He had the grace to look ashamed. She feels the house should be considered marital property, subject to division in the divorce. It's not, I said firmly.
And you know it.
The deed is in my name alone, by your choice. You signed it over to me 8 years ago. To protect it from creditors, he argued. Not to exclude me permanently. The reason doesn't change the legal reality, I countered. But that's not the point. The point is that Vivian is after your money, possibly your life, and definitely my house. And she's willing to go to extreme lengths to get what she wants. Richard set the documents down, his expression hardening. This is all circumstantial. Accusations without proof. For all I know, you fabricated this entire file to turn me against Vivian. I stared at him, incredulous. Fabricated? Richard, these are official records. Police reports, newspaper articles. Why would I go to such elaborate lengths? Because you're bitter, he said coldly. Because I found happiness with someone else and you can't stand it. First you fake your own death to humiliate me, and now this. He stood abruptly. I won't listen to any more of your lies. They're not lies, I insisted, rising to face him. Vivian is dangerous, Richard. She sent me a death threat, a doll made to look like me with its neck broken and a knife in its chest. She's not who you think she is. For a moment, doubt flickered across his face. Then his expression closed off, the wall between us rising higher than ever. Goodbye, Eleanor. I won't be meeting you like this again. Richard, please. I caught his arm as he turned to leave. If you won't believe me, at least look into her background yourself. Hire your own investigator. Check her story. For your own safety. He shook off my hand. Don't contact me again except through my lawyer. I watched him walk away, his back stiff with anger and denial. I had tried. Whatever happened next, I had tried to warn him. But as I gathered the scattered documents, a new fear took root. In showing my hand to Richard, had I just alerted Vivian to the fact that I knew her secrets? And if so, what would her next move be? I hurried to my car, suddenly feeling exposed in the empty garden. As I slid behind the wheel, my phone rang, an unknown number. Hello. I answered cautiously. Mrs. Montgomery. Renata's voice was terse. We need to meet.
Now.
There's been a development. What kind of development? Not over the phone, she said. The usual place, 1 hour. An hour later, I sat across from Renata in our now familiar coffee shop, my hands wrapped around a mug I had no intention of drinking from. She knows, Renata said without preamble. Victoria knows I've been investigating her. My stomach dropped.
How?
I'm not sure yet, but one of my contacts in Chicago called this morning. Someone matching Victoria's description has been asking questions about who's been poking into the Whitman case. And this morning, I found this on my windshield. She slid a photo across the table. It was a picture of me and Renata taken during our previous meeting in this very coffee shop. A red X had been drawn across my face. "She's watching us," I whispered. Renata nodded grimly. "And she's sending a message. The question is, what do we do now?" I thought of Richard, walking away in the botanical garden, refusing to believe the truth about the woman he was living with. I thought of the broken doll, the threat it represented. I thought of Harold Whitman, drowned in his bathtub, and Gregory Parsons, dead of a heart attack. "We go to the police," I decided. "Today. With everything we have." Renata looked skeptical. "It's all circumstantial, Mrs. Montgomery. No prosecutor would touch it." "Maybe not," I agreed. "But we can at least file a report about the threats against me. Get it on record. And maybe, if we're lucky, the police will take a closer look at Victoria Caruso." "It's worth a try," Renata conceded. "But you should know, people like her, they're careful. They don't leave evidence. That's why she's gotten away with it twice already." "Then we'll have to be smarter than she is," I said, a plan forming in my mind. "We'll need to catch her in the act." Renata's eyes widened. "You're not suggesting." "I'm suggesting that if Victoria wants me dead badly enough to send threats, then perhaps we should give her the opportunity to try. Under controlled circumstances, of course." "That's extremely dangerous," Renata warned. "If she's killed before, she won't succeed this time," I assured her. "Because we'll be ready." After filing a police report that was received with professional but obvious skepticism, "We'll look into it, Mrs. Montgomery, but without concrete evidence of a threat," I returned home to find Margaret waiting anxiously in the foyer. "Where have you been?" she demanded. "I've been calling for hours. I realized I'd left my phone in the car during my meeting with the police." "I'm sorry, sweetheart. I had some errands to run." She studied my face, clearly not believing me. "Mom, what's going on? You've been acting strange for days. Secretive phone calls, mysterious meetings. Are you in some kind of trouble?" I hesitated. How much should I tell her? I didn't want to frighten her, but I also couldn't keep her completely in the dark, not when danger might be circling closer. "Let's sit down," I suggested, leading her to the living room. "There are some things you should know." Over the next hour, I gave her a carefully edited version of what I'd learned about Vivian, her real identity, her suspicious past, the threatening doll. I omitted the more disturbing details about the previous deaths and downplayed the level of danger, presenting it more as a case of harassment than potential murder. "That's why I've upgraded the security system," I explained. "Just as a precaution." Margaret looked horrified. "Mom, you need to tell Thomas. We should hire bodyguards or you could come stay with me in the city for a while." "I'm not running for my own home," I said firmly. "And I've already taken appropriate measures. Renata is very thorough, and the police are aware of the situation." "Did they seem concerned?" she pressed. I avoided her gaze. "They're looking into it." "Which means they didn't take it seriously," Margaret translated. "Mom, please. At least let me stay here with you for a while longer." "You have your job, your life in the city," I protested. "I can't ask you to put everything on hold." "You're not asking. I'm offering." Her expression softened. "After everything that's happened, thinking you were dying, then discovering you were alive. Now this. I'm not ready to leave you alone just yet." I felt a rush of love for my daughter, so fierce it almost brought tears to my eyes. "All right," I conceded, "but just for a little while longer. And you have to promise not to worry unnecessarily." She smiled wryly. "Define unnecessarily." That night, as Margaret slept in her childhood bedroom down the hall, I lay awake planning my next move. If Victoria was watching me, if she knew I was investigating her, then I needed to be prepared for her to escalate. The most obvious approach would be to set a trap, to make myself appear vulnerable, to give her an opportunity she couldn't resist, all while ensuring I remained completely safe.
But how?
And could I justify putting myself at risk, even calculated risk, with Margaret in the house? The answer came to me just as I was drifting to sleep. The annual charity gala at the country club, scheduled for the following weekend. Richard would certainly attend. He'd been on the board for years, and he would likely bring Vivian. It would be the perfect opportunity to confront her publicly, to let her know I knew her secrets, and to gauge her reaction. It was risky, but with enough witnesses around, she wouldn't dare do anything overt. And her response might give me the evidence I needed to convince the police she was a genuine threat. The next morning, I called Wilson to confirm my attendance at the gala I had initially declined, not wanting to face the inevitable awkwardness with Richard, and to discuss legal strategies regarding Vivian's threats. A public confrontation is unwise, Eleanor, Wilson cautioned. If you truly believe this woman is dangerous, why provoke her? Because right now, she's operating in the shadows, I explained. She's sending anonymous threats, making secret plans. I want to force her into the open, where her actions will be witnessed and documented. Wilson sighed heavily. I understand your reasoning, but I strongly advise against it. If you must attend the gala, at least bring security. And for God's sake, don't go anywhere alone. I'll be careful, I promised. And Margaret will be with me the entire time. Over the next few days, I prepared meticulously for the gala. I selected a striking crimson gown, the same shade as the dress I'd worn for my Christmas Eve resurrection, and arranged for a car service rather than driving myself. I asked Renata to be present, posing as another guest, to observe Vivian's reactions and behavior. And I crafted my approach carefully. I wouldn't accuse Vivian outright. That would only give her plausible deniability. Instead, I would drop subtle references to her past, to Chicago, to Harold Whitman. I would watch her face for that flash of recognition, of fear. And I would make it clear, in terms only she would fully understand, that I knew exactly who and what she was. The night of the gala arrived, cold and clear, stars glittering like diamonds against the velvet sky. Margaret looked beautiful in a midnight blue gown, her dark hair swept up in an elegant twist. As we descended the staircase together, I felt a surge of pride and determination. Whatever happened tonight, I would protect my daughter, my home, my life. Ready? Margaret asked, squeezing my hand as our car pulled up to the country club entrance. I nodded, taking a deep breath. Ready. The grand ballroom was already crowded when we arrived, the county's elite dressed in their finest, champagne flowing freely. I spotted several familiar faces, friends, neighbors, business associates, all of whom greeted me with a mixture of warmth and barely concealed curiosity. My miraculous recovery and subsequent separation from Richard had been the talk of the town for weeks. I scanned the room, looking for Richard and Vivian. They hadn't arrived yet, but their presence was inevitable. Richard had chaired the gala committee for the past 5 years. His absence would be unthinkable. Mrs. Montgomery. A deep voice at my elbow made me turn. James Wilson stood there, elegant in his tuxedo, a flute of champagne in his hand. You look stunning tonight. Thank you, James, I smiled. I wasn't sure you'd be here. And miss the social event of the season? He returned with a slight smile. Besides, I thought you might appreciate having another ally in the room. I felt a rush of gratitude. Wilson had been more than just my attorney through this ordeal. He had become a trusted friend and advisor. They just arrived, Margaret murmured, nodding toward the entrance. I turned to see Richard and Vivian making their entrance, a picture-perfect couple. Richard looked distinguished as always in his tuxedo, but it was Vivian who commanded attention. She wore a shimmering silver gown that clung to every curve, her blonde hair cascading over one shoulder, diamonds glittering at her throat and ears. The image struck me forcefully. This was how it would have been if I had truly died. Richard and Vivian, the power couple, graciously accepting condolences while secretly celebrating their freedom. My stomach clenched at the thought. Mom, Margaret touched my arm, concern in her eyes. We don't have to stay if this is too difficult. I squared my shoulders. It's not difficult at all. In fact, I think it's time I greeted our hostess. Before Margaret could protest, I moved through the crowd toward the gala chairwoman, Elaine Harrington, who happened to be standing near the entrance where Richard and Vivian were still receiving greetings from other guests. Eleanor, Elaine exclaimed, air-kissing both my cheeks. You look absolutely radiant. That color is divine on you.
Thank you, Elaine.
The decorations are lovely this year. You've outdone yourself. As I'd anticipated, our conversation caught Richard's attention. He turned, his expression freezing when he saw me. Beside him, Vivian's perfect features hardened almost imperceptibly, her smile becoming fixed. "Richard," Elaine called, oblivious to the tension. "Look who's here." "Eleanor, you remember Richard's friend, Vivian Carter, don't you?" The deliberate hesitation before friend and the pointed use of Vivian's full name made her meaning clear. Elaine Harrington might be hosting Richard and his mistress out of social obligation, but she hadn't forgotten her decades-long friendship with me. "Of course," I said smoothly, extending my hand to Vivian. Though I believe in Chicago, she was known as Victoria Caruso. "Isn't that right, Vivian?" The blood drained from her face so rapidly I thought she might faint. Beside her, Richard stiffened, his eyes darting between us. I don't know what you're talking about," Vivian stammered, ignoring my outstretched hand.
No?
"My mistake." I smiled pleasantly. I must be thinking of someone else. Someone who knew Harold Whitman. Tragic story. He drowned in his bathtub, as I recall. Vivian's composure cracked further, a muscle twitching near her eye. "Richard," she said tightly, "I need some air." "Yes. Why don't you both step outside?" I suggested. "The garden is lovely this time of year, especially near the Japanese pond. So peaceful, so private." The implication was clear, at least to Richard, who had met me at that very spot days earlier. His face darkened with anger and something else, fear. "If you'll excuse us," he muttered, placing his hand on Vivian's back and steering her away. Elaine watched them go, her eyebrows raised in fascination. "Well," she said, turning back to me, "I sense there's a story there." "Several, in fact," I replied. "But tonight is about the charity, not personal drama." "How are the donations coming along?" As I'd hoped, my public reference to Vivian's past had rattled her. Throughout the evening, I caught her watching me from across the room, her expression a mixture of fury and calculation. She stayed close to Richard, speaking urgently into his ear at times, then pasting on a smile whenever anyone approached. "She looks like she's seen a ghost," Margaret observed as we took our seats for dinner. "What exactly did you say to her?" "Just a friendly greeting," I said innocently, "and a small reminder that I know more about her than she thinks." "Mom," Margaret sighed. "You promised you wouldn't confront her." "I didn't confront her. I merely unsettled her. There's a difference." After dinner came the speeches. Richard, as former committee chair, was expected to say a few words before introducing this year's recipient of the Community Service Award. He performed admirably, his public persona intact despite the obvious tension of the evening. When the formal portion of the event concluded, the band began playing and couples moved to the dance floor. I remained at our table, chatting with Margaret and a few friends who stopped by, always keeping Vivian in my peripheral vision. Around 11, I excused myself to visit the ladies' room. Margaret made to accompany me, but I waved her off. "I'll just be a minute, sweetheart. Finish your conversation." The country club's ladies' lounge was a luxurious affair, plush seating, fresh flowers, a separate area with vanities for touching up makeup. At this hour, it was deserted, everyone having returned to the ballroom for dancing. I was washing my hands when the door opened behind me. In the mirror, I saw Vivian enter, her silver gown catching the light, her expression coldly determined. "Hello, Victoria," I said calmly, turning to face her. "Or do you prefer Vivian now?" She let the door swing shut behind her, her eyes never leaving mine. "You think you're so clever," she said, her voice low and venomous. "Digging into my past, making little hints in public. What exactly are you trying to accomplish?" I dried my hands slowly, deliberately. "I'm simply making sure everyone knows exactly who they're dealing with. A woman who changes her name, her history, her entire identity. A woman who profits from tragedy." "You know nothing about me," she hissed. "I know everything about you," I countered. "Harold Whitman, Gregory Parsons, the life insurance policies, the convenient accidents, the quick disappearances afterward." For a moment, Naked shock registered on her face. Then her features smoothed into a mask of controlled anger. Fairy tales, she dismissed. And even if they weren't, you can't prove anything. No one could. Perhaps not about the past, I conceded. But the present? The threats you've sent me? The doll with the broken neck? Those I can prove. She laughed, a brittle sound. A doll? Really, Eleanor? How childish. And how convenient that you received this threat with no witnesses. There were witnesses to you declaring yourself the lady of the house at my Christmas dinner, I reminded her. To your fury when you discovered I wasn't actually dead. To your threats afterward. Her eyes narrowed. You humiliated me that night. You deserved worse, I said bluntly. You were planning to move into my home before I was even cold in my grave. Tell me, what were your plans for Richard once you had secured your position? Another tragic accident? Another insurance policy? Something flickered in her eyes, a cold, calculating light that sent a chill down my spine. You have an overactive imagination, Eleanor. Richard and I love each other. We're building a future together. A future funded by his money in my house, I said. Except it will never happen. The house is mine, legally and irrevocably. And as for Richard, I shook my head. He's beginning to see you for what you really are. Is that what you think? She stepped closer, her perfume, Chanel No. 5, always the same, enveloping me. Richard believes me, not you. He thinks you're a bitter, vengeful woman who can't accept that he's moved on, who would fake her own death just to punish him. And yet you're the one who sent me death threats, I pointed out. Who's been pushing him to fight for assets that aren't his. Who changed her name and reinvented herself after previous entanglements ended in death. Coincidences, she said dismissively. Bad luck. And as for the threats, she smiled, cold and predatory. If I wanted you dead, Eleanor, you would be dead already. The door to the lounge began to open. Vivian stepped back quickly, her expression transforming into pleasant neutrality as Margaret entered. Mom, she called, concern evident in her voice. You've been gone a while. I was worried. I'm fine, sweetheart, I assured her, not taking my eyes off Vivian. Miss Carter and I were just having a chat about old times. Weren't we, Vivian? Very illuminating, Vivian agreed with a brittle smile. But I should get back to Richard. He'll be wondering where I've gone. She brushed past Margaret, pausing in the doorway to look back at me. We'll continue our conversation another time, Eleanor. Somewhere more private. After she left, Margaret turned to me, eyes wide. What was that about? You look pale. I took a deep breath, steadying myself against the vanity. Just a difference of opinion, I said lightly. Nothing to worry about. But there was plenty to worry about. Vivian's parting words had been a clear threat, another confrontation, somewhere without witnesses. And the cold light in her eyes when she'd said, if I wanted you dead, had left no doubt in my mind. Victoria Caruso was indeed capable of murder. I think we should go home, I told Margaret. It's been a long evening. In the car on the way back to the estate, I replayed my conversation with Vivian, analyzing every word, every nuance. She hadn't denied her past outright. She'd merely dismissed it as coincidence, as bad luck. And she'd all but admitted to sending the threatening doll, even as she mocked the idea. Most chilling of all, she'd implied that my death would come at a time and place of her choosing. Not if, but when. I needed to accelerate my plans. The public confrontation had confirmed my suspicions about Vivian's nature, but it had also forced her hand. She wouldn't wait much longer to act. When we arrived home, I checked the security system carefully before allowing Margaret inside. All was secure, no breaches, no unauthorized access attempts. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of danger lurking just beyond the circle of light cast by our home. Mom, Margaret said as we prepared for bed, I think you should come stay with me in the city for a while. Just until this situation with Vivian is resolved. I'm not leaving my home, I replied firmly. That's exactly what she wants. To drive me away, to create an opening. Then let me call Thomas. He should know what's happening, and maybe he can help. He has connections in law enforcement through his firm. I hesitated. Involving Thomas meant putting another of my children at risk, or at least in the line of fire. But Margaret was right. He deserved to know, and his professional resources might prove valuable. All right, I conceded. Call him in the morning, but tell him not to do anything rash. We need to be strategic about this. That night, sleep eluded me. I lay awake, listening to the creaks and sighs of the old house, startling at every unexpected sound. Around 3 in the morning, I gave up and went downstairs to make tea. The kitchen was dark, illuminated only by the dim light over the stove that I always left on. As the kettle heated, I leaned against the counter, gazing out at the moonlit garden. The roses I'd planted 23 years ago were dormant now, their thorny branches bare in the winter chill. Something moved at the edge of the property, a shadow, darker than the surrounding night. I froze, my heart pounding. Was someone out there? Or was my imagination working overtime, fueled by stress and lack of sleep? I reached for my phone, intending to check the security cameras, when a soft click made me turn. The kitchen door, the one leading to the side garden, was opening slowly, inch by inch. I backed away, looking frantically for a weapon. The knife block was across the room, too far to reach without crossing in front of the door. The heavy cast iron skillet hanging from the pot rack would do. I grasped its handle just as the door swung fully open. A figure stood silhouetted in the doorway, tall and broad-shouldered. I raised the skillet, prepared to defend myself. "Mom?" Thomas's voice broke the silence. "It's me. Don't swing that thing." Relief flooded through me, followed quickly by confusion. "Thomas? What on earth are you doing here at this hour? And why are you coming in through the garden door?" He stepped fully into the kitchen, closing the door behind him. In the dim light, I could see he was wearing a dark coat over what appeared to be pajama pants and a sweatshirt, his hair disheveled as if he'd dressed in a hurry. "Margaret called me," he explained, "about an hour ago. She was frantic, said you were in danger, that you needed me to come right away." A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the winter night. I've been awake for hours. Margaret never came downstairs, and I didn't hear her on the phone. Thomas's expression shifted from confusion to alarm. Then who? A scream from upstairs cut him off, Margaret's voice, high and terrified. We both moved at once, Thomas sprinting ahead of me toward the main staircase. "Margaret," I called, fear lending speed to my feet. "We're coming." We took the stairs 2 at a time, racing down the hallway toward Margaret's bedroom. The door was ajar, a sliver of light spilling into the corridor. Thomas burst into the room first, with me right behind him. Margaret stood backed against her dresser, her face pale with shock. Across the room, her bedroom window was wide open, curtains billowing in the cold night air. "He was here," she gasped, pointing toward the window.
A man.
He was standing right there, watching me sleep. When I woke up, he ran. Thomas crossed to the window, leaning out to scan the grounds below. "I don't see anyone," he reported, pulling the window closed and latching it. But they could have made it to the tree line by now. I went to Margaret, wrapping my arms around her trembling form. "Are you hurt? Did he touch you?" She shook her head.
No.
I opened my eyes and he was there, just watching. It was so creepy. She looked at Thomas. "But how did you get here so fast?" "I only screamed a minute ago." "Someone called me," Thomas said grimly. "Using your phone, apparently. Said Mom was in danger, and I needed to come right away. I was already on my way when you screamed." "My phone." Margaret looked confused. "But it's right here." She gestured to her nightstand, where her phone lay charging. "Check your call history," I suggested, a suspicion forming. Margaret unlocked her phone and checked. "No outgoing calls tonight," she confirmed. "The last call I made was to you this morning, Thomas." "Then someone spoofed your number," Thomas concluded. "Which means this wasn't random. Someone wanted to get me out of my apartment, to lure me here in the middle of the night. Or to ensure I was alone in the kitchen when they came through the side door," I added quietly. "If you hadn't arrived when you did." The implications hung in the air between us. Someone had orchestrated this, had planned to separate us, to create vulnerability. And there was only one person with both motive and opportunity. "I'm calling the police," Thomas declared, pulling out his own phone. This time, I didn't object. The break-in, the faked phone call, these were concrete evidence of threat, not just the circumstantial connections I'd presented before. While Thomas spoke with the dispatcher, I helped Margaret into a robe and slippers. "Pack an overnight bag," I told her. "After the police leave, we're not staying here." "Where will we go?" she asked, still shaken. "My place," Thomas answered, ending his call. "Police are on their way. They said to stay together and not touch anything the intruder might have." Within 15 minutes, patrol cars arrived, lights flashing in the driveway. Officers searched the house and grounds, but found no one. They took statements from all three of us, photographed the open window, and dusted for fingerprints, though they didn't seem optimistic about finding any. "Probably wore gloves," the lead officer observed. "Most break-ins are opportunity crimes, but this feels targeted. Any idea who might want to frighten you, Mrs. Montgomery?" I hesitated, then told him about Vivian. Her real identity, her suspicious past, the threatening doll, our confrontation at the gala. He listened attentively, making notes, but I could see the skepticism in his eyes. "We'll look into it," he promised. "In the meantime, you're right to stay somewhere else for a few days. And I'd recommend upgrading your security system." "It's already top of the line," I said, frustrated. "Whoever did this knew how to bypass it." "Then they had inside knowledge," he replied. "Someone who's been in the house before, who knows its vulnerabilities." Like Richard's executive assistant, I thought but didn't say. Like the woman who expected to live here after I died. By dawn, we had packed essential items and were ready to leave. The police had finished their investigation, promising to patrol the area more frequently in the coming days. Thomas's apartment in the city would be our sanctuary until we could determine our next steps. As we prepared to leave, I took a final walk through the house, making sure all windows and doors were secure. In the dining room, I paused, looking at the chair where Vivian had stood on Christmas Eve, declaring herself the lady of the house. "This isn't over," I murmured, echoing her words. "Not by a long shot." Thomas's apartment was a sleek, modern space in a high-security building in Manhattan, the perfect temporary refuge. 2 bedrooms, a spacious living area, and most importantly, a doorman who screened all visitors. "You'll be safe here," he assured us as he showed Margaret to the guest room. "No one gets up to this floor without being announced and approved." I took the sofa in the living room, insisting Margaret needed the proper bed more than I did. In truth, I doubted I would sleep much anyway. My mind was racing, reviewing everything that had happened, looking for patterns, for weaknesses in Vivian's strategy. The break-in had been bold, too bold. If her goal was simply to eliminate me, there were subtler ways. No, this had been about fear, about control. She wanted me terrified, off balance, driven from my home. And she had succeeded, at least temporarily. I was now in exile from my own house, huddled in my son's apartment, like a refugee. The thought ignited a slow burn of anger in my chest. This woman, this interloper, had disrupted my life, threatened my family, and forced me to retreat. No more. It was time to take the offensive. The next morning, over coffee in Thomas's kitchen, I outlined my plan to my children. "We need to draw her out," I explained. "Get her to make a move that can't be explained away, that provides concrete evidence of her intentions." "You mean use yourself as bait?" Thomas said flatly. "Absolutely not." "Not exactly," I clarified. "I'm suggesting we make her believe she has an opportunity, while ensuring I'm completely protected."
"How?"
Margaret asked, her expression troubled. "A controlled environment. Somewhere public enough to have witnesses, private enough for her to feel she can act, and secure enough that I'm never actually in danger." Thomas shook his head. "This isn't a movie, Mom. You can't just set a trap for a potentially dangerous person and expect everything to go according to plan." "I'm not suggesting we do this alone," I assured him. "We'll involve the police. With the break-in, they're finally taking this seriously. And Renata can help coordinate." "It's still risky," Margaret insisted. "This woman has possibly killed before. What if something goes wrong?" "That's why we need to plan carefully," I said. "And why I need both of you to help me." They exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. Finally, Thomas sighed. "What exactly did you have in mind?" he asked. I smiled, relieved they were at least willing to listen. "First, we need to establish a pattern, let Vivian think she knows my movements, my vulnerabilities. Then, we set the stage for a confrontation on our terms." Over the next hour, I laid out my strategy in detail. Thomas, with his legal mind, poked holes in my initial plan, helping refine it into something more solid. Margaret, always the creative one, contributed ideas for making the scenario believable. By the time we finished our second pot of coffee, we had the outlines of a workable plan. Now, we just needed help to execute it. Thomas called in a favor from a former classmate who now worked as a detective in the NYPD. Margaret reached out to a friend who managed the Westchester Garden Center, a sprawling indoor botanical garden that would provide the perfect setting for our trap. And I called Renata, bringing her fully into the loop. "This is risky," Renata warned, echoing my children's concerns. "But if we're careful, it could work. Victoria Caruso has gotten sloppy lately, the break-in, the threats. She's emotional, which means she's more likely to make mistakes." "Exactly," I agreed. "And we need to push her to make a big one that can't be explained away." The plan was set in motion the following day. I would return to my home, ostensibly to retrieve more belongings, making sure word reached Vivian through carefully placed gossip. The house would appear minimally secured, an invitation too tempting to resist. Meanwhile, Thomas would work with his police contact to ensure surveillance was in place, both at the house and later at the garden center, where the final confrontation would occur. Margaret would coordinate with Renata, creating a seemingly perfect opportunity for Vivian to strike. And I would be the lure, the target, but protected at every step. "I still don't like this," Thomas muttered as he drove me back to the estate 3 days later. "It feels like we're putting you in unnecessary danger." "The danger already exists," I reminded him. "This way, we control the circumstances." The house looked exactly as we had left it, peaceful in the winter sunshine. Thomas insisted on checking every room, every closet. Before he was satisfied, no one was lying in wait. "All right," he said finally. "I'll be parked down the street. The security company is monitoring all cameras remotely, and they'll alert me to any unusual activity. You have 2 hours to make it look like you're gathering essentials. Then we leave together." I nodded, already moving through the house with purpose, selecting items that would make my temporary relocation seem genuine. Clothes, toiletries, important documents, all went into suitcases I placed prominently near the front door. As planned, I made several phone calls on the landline, speaking loudly enough that anyone listening would hear my intentions clearly. "Yes, Margaret, I'll be back at Thomas's by dinner," I said into the receiver. "But first I need to stop at the garden center. Those orchids I ordered months ago finally arrived, and if I don't pick them up today, they'll give them to someone else." After the call, I continue my packing, all the while aware of being watched. Not just by the security cameras or by Thomas from his surveillance position, but by someone else, someone waiting for an opportunity. Precisely 2 hours later, Thomas returned, helping me load the suitcases into his car. We drove away, giving every appearance of leaving the house unoccupied. In reality, 2 plainclothes officers were now positioned inside, waiting to catch anyone who might attempt to enter. And the security system, despite appearances, was fully activated. "Phase 1 complete," Thomas said as we drove toward the city. "Now we wait." We didn't have to wait long. That evening, as we gathered in Thomas's apartment, a call came from the security company. "Motion detected at the rear entrance," the operator reported. "Camera 3 shows a figure attempting to access the kitchen door." Thomas put the call on speaker. "Can you identify the intruder?" "Female, approximately 5'7", light-colored hair, wearing dark clothing and what appears to be gloves." I exchanged glances with Margaret and Thomas. "Vivian, the police have been notified," the operator continued. "They should be on scene within minutes." We waited in tense silence for the next update. It came 15 minutes later, not from the security company, but from Thomas's police contact. "We missed her," Detective Ramirez reported, frustration evident in his voice. "She must have spotted the patrol car approaching and fled before they could secure the perimeter. Officers are searching the grounds, but so far, nothing." Disappointment washed over me, but not surprise. Victoria, had evaded capture before. She was cautious, experienced. "What about evidence?" Thomas asked. "Did she leave anything behind?" "Fingerprints, tools." "The techs are processing the scene now," Ramirez replied. "Preliminary findings show she was using some kind of electronic device to interfere with the alarm system. Sophisticated stuff. This wasn't an amateur job." "So we've confirmed she's targeting the house," I said, "but we still don't have proof she's targeting me specifically." "Not yet," Ramirez agreed. "But this gives us grounds to watch her more closely. And it makes your garden center plan more credible. We can have officers in place, ready to intervene if she takes the bait." The garden center phase of our plan was scheduled for 2 days later. I would arrive alone, ostensibly to collect my orchids, and spend time browsing the indoor tropical pavilion, a secluded area with multiple entrances and limited staff presence during the winter months. Perfect for an ambush. Perfect for a trap. The morning of the operation, I dressed with care, clothes that would allow freedom of movement, comfortable shoes I could run in if necessary. Beneath my coat, I wore a lightweight bulletproof vest provided by Ramirez. Just a precaution, he'd assured me, though the weight of it against my ribs felt anything but precautionary. Most importantly, I was wired. A small microphone hidden in my scarf would transmit everything to the police team stationed throughout the garden center. A panic button disguised as a decorative pin on my lapel would summon immediate assistance if needed. Remember, Ramirez cautioned during our final briefing, the goal is to get her to reveal her intentions verbally. We need concrete threats, specific statements that can't be interpreted innocently. Don't put yourself in physical danger. We'll intervene before it gets to that point. I nodded, my mouth dry despite my outward calm. "I understand." Thomas squeezed my hand. "It's not too late to call this off. We could find another way." "This is the way," I said firmly. "She's already shown she's willing to break into my home. Next time, I might not be so lucky." This ends today. The Westchester Garden Center was quiet when I arrived, just as we'd anticipated. January was their slowest month, with few visitors braving the cold to see the primarily dormant outdoor gardens. The indoor pavilions remained open, but were staffed minimally. I checked in at the main desk, confirming my orchid order was ready for pickup. "I'll collect it on my way out," I told the clerk. "I'd like to visit the tropical pavilion first." "Of course, Mrs. Montgomery. It's lovely in there today. They just installed a new waterfall feature in the rainforest section." I thanked her and made my way toward the tropical pavilion, moving unhurriedly, pausing occasionally as if admiring the winter-barren landscape through the corridor windows. Anyone watching would see a woman with no particular agenda, no awareness of being followed. The tropical pavilion was a massive glass structure housing plants from equatorial regions, massive palms, exotic flowers, vines that twisted overhead to create a verdant canopy. The air was warm and humid, a stark contrast to the January chill outside. I wandered the winding paths, appearing to study the botanical displays while actually surveying my surroundings, noting the positions of the undercover officers scattered throughout. Ramirez himself was posing as a maintenance worker, fiddling with an irrigation control panel near the central fountain. For 30 minutes, I explored the pavilion, moving gradually toward the most secluded area, the newly installed rainforest grotto, complete with the waterfall the clerk had mentioned. The sound of falling water would make conversation difficult to overhear for regular visitors, but the microphone I wore would still transmit clearly to the police team. As I rounded a bend in the path, entering the grotto area, I spotted a familiar figure seated on a stone bench near the waterfall. Vivian. She wore a dark coat despite the pavilion's warmth, her blonde hair pulled back in a severe ponytail. She appeared to be reading a guidebook, but her eyes lifted to track my movement as I approached. I pretended not to notice her, moving to examine a display of tropical orchids near the water feature. From the corner of my eye, I saw her close her book and stand, moving casually in my direction. "Eleanor," she called, her voice carrying over the sound of the waterfall. What a surprise. I turned, affecting mild shock at her presence. "Vivian, I didn't expect to see you here." "I love orchids," she said, gesturing to the display I'd been examining. "They're such complex flowers. Deceptive, even. Some species mimic the appearance and scent of female insects to lure males for pollination." She smiled thinly. "Nature's con artists." "How fascinating," I replied, matching her false pleasantness. "Are you here alone?" "Richard had business in the city," she said, moving closer. "And I needed some time to think, to plan." "Plan what?" Her smile turned predatory. "My future. Our future. Richard and I have decided to fight for what's rightfully his. The house, specifically." "The house is mine, legally and irrevocably," I reminded her. "As I've explained repeatedly, legal situations can change," she countered, "especially when new evidence emerges." I raised an eyebrow. "What evidence?" "Evidence that you committed fraud," she said smoothly. "That you faked medical records, forged a death certificate. Serious crimes, Eleanor. The kind that could result in prison time." "That's absurd," I scoffed, though my heart rate accelerated. She was right. What I'd done wasn't entirely legal. And while proving it would be difficult, the mere suggestion could create complications. "Is it?" She moved closer still, her voice dropping. "I have copies of your supposed medical records. The ones showing terminal cancer that miraculously disappeared. I have testimony from the doctor, who was pressured to sign your death certificate. I have enough to create serious problems for you, Eleanor." "Even if that were true," I said carefully, "what does it have to do with the house?" "Everything," she hissed. "Because when you're fighting criminal charges, defending your precious estate will become challenging. Richard and I are prepared to be generous, though. We'll drop everything, make it all go away, in exchange for the house." "Blackmail," I said flatly. "That's your plan?" She shrugged elegantly. "I prefer to think of it as negotiation. And it's only the beginning of what I'm prepared to do." "Like breaking into my home?" I challenged. "Sending threatening dolls? Frightening my daughter?" A flicker of surprise crossed her face, quickly masked. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't you?" "The police found evidence of your presence at my house 2 nights ago. They're processing it now. Fingerprints, DNA, traces of that distinctive perfume you always wear." It was a bluff. The intruder had been too careful to leave such evidence, but Vivian didn't know that. Her expression hardened. "Prove it was me. Prove any of it. You can't, can you?" Just like Harold Whitman's family couldn't prove I had anything to do with his unfortunate accident. There it was, the admission I'd been waiting for. I kept my expression neutral, not wanting to alert her that she'd revealed too much. "So you admit it," I said quietly. "You did kill Harold Whitman. And Gregory Parsons too, I imagine." She laughed, the sound echoing in the humid air of the grotto. "I admit nothing. I'm simply pointing out that accusations require proof. And you have none. Then why break into my home? Why threaten me with that grotesque doll?" "If someone did those things, and I'm not saying they did, perhaps it was to send a message. A warning." She stepped closer, lowering her voice further. "Back off, Eleanor. Drop this vendetta against me. Accept that Richard has moved on, that your time has passed." "Or what?" I challenged. Her eyes turned cold, calculating. "Or accidents happen. Even to people who have miraculously recovered from terminal cancer. Even to their children." My blood ran cold at the implied threat to Thomas and Margaret. "You're threatening my family now." "I'm merely observing that life is unpredictable," she said with mock innocence. "One day you're perfectly healthy, the next," she snapped her fingers, tragedy strikes. A fall down the stairs. A car with faulty brakes. A house fire while everyone sleeps. "You won't get away with it," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. "People know about you now. About your past, your pattern." "People," she echoed, her lip curling. "You mean your private investigator?" The one who's been following me, digging into my history? She should be more careful. Her apartment building has such old wiring. A fire could start so easily. The threat against Renata confirmed what I already suspected. Vivian knew she was being investigated, and she was prepared to eliminate anyone who posed a threat to her plans. What exactly do you want, Vivian? I asked, deciding to push her further. Beyond the house, beyond Richard's money. What is it you're really after? Something shifted in her expression, a glimpse of something raw and wounded beneath the polished surface. What everyone wants, she said after a moment. Security, power, the certainty that I'll never be at anyone else's mercy again. For an instant, I almost felt sympathy for her. What had happened to Victoria Caruso to turn her into this calculating predator? What desperate circumstances had shaped her into someone who saw murder as a viable path to security? But the moment passed quickly. Whatever her motivations, she had threatened my children. She had broken into my home. She had implied, with chilling casualness, that she would eliminate anyone who stood in her way. I understand wanting security, I said carefully, but not at the expense of others' lives. Not through deception and violence. Her expression hardened again. We all do what we must to survive, Eleanor. Some of us are just more efficient about it. Is that what you call it? Efficiency. I call it pragmatism, she corrected. Sentiment is a luxury for people who've never had to fight for anything. People like you, born into comfort, marrying into wealth. You've never known real desperation. You know nothing about my life, I said quietly. About what I've endured, what I've overcome. I know you're an obstacle, she replied coldly. One that needs to be removed. The threat hung in the air between us, explicit now. I pressed the panic button on my lapel, the signal that I'd gotten what we needed. And how do you plan to remove me? I asked, playing for time as I sensed movement in the foliage around us, the police team moving into position. Vivian smiled, reaching into her coat pocket. I thought about making it look like suicide. A grieving widow who couldn't bear the humiliation of her husband's betrayal. But then I realized no one would believe that. Not after your dramatic resurrection at Christmas. Her hand emerged from her pocket holding a small glass vial. So, I decided on something more natural. A rare toxin derived from a plant much like these. She gestured to the tropical foliage surrounding us. Untraceable in standard toxicology screenings. Causes symptoms identical to a massive stroke. By the time anyone thinks to look deeper, you'll be cremated, and I'll be comforting Richard in his time of need. You seem very confident, I observed, fighting to keep my voice steady as I backed away slightly. I've had practice, she said simply. Harold made it easy. Drunk in the bathtub, barely conscious when I held his head under. Gregory was even simpler. His heart was already weak, the stimulant I gave him barely detectable. But you, she smiled, a cold, predatory expression. You've been my greatest challenge. So determined to live, to fight. I almost admire it. Police. Freeze. Ramirez's voice cut through the humid air, officers emerging from concealment around us, weapons drawn. Vivian's eyes widened in shock, then narrowed in fury as she realized she'd been trapped. Her gaze locked on me, hatred blazing in her eyes. You set me up, she hissed. You threatened my family, I replied calmly. Did you really think I wouldn't fight back? Ramirez approached cautiously, his gun trained on Vivian. Drop the vial, Ms. Caruso. Slowly. For a moment, I thought she might resist, might even attempt to use the toxin against the approaching officers. But calculation flickered across her face. She was already planning her defense, her escape. She set the vial carefully on the stone ledge beside her, raising her hands. This is a misunderstanding, she said smoothly. I was simply showing Mrs. Montgomery a rare plant extract I purchased legally for my botanical research. Save it for your lawyer, Ramirez said, nodding to another officer who moved forward with handcuffs. Victoria Caruso, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, breaking and entering, making terrorist threats, and attempted poisoning. You have the right to remain silent. As they led her away, Vivian turned her head to lock eyes with me one last time. This isn't over, Eleanor, she called. Not by a long shot. I stood still among the tropical plants, the humid air suddenly feeling oppressive rather than warm. It was done. The trap had worked perfectly, better than we'd dared hope. Vivian had not only threatened me explicitly, but had admitted to her previous murders and had been caught with the means to commit another. Yet her parting words echoed in my mind. This isn't over. And somehow I knew she was right. The next 24 hours passed in a blur of police statements, evidence processing, and media frenzy. The arrest of Victoria Caruso, aka Vivian Carter, on suspicion of multiple murders made headlines across the state. Her connection to Richard, their affair, my death, and resurrection, all of it became public fodder, dissected and sensationalized in ways that would have mortified me just months earlier. Now, I found I didn't care. Let them talk. Let them speculate. The truth, that I had outmaneuvered a killer who had targeted my family, was far more satisfying than any gossip could be damaging. Richard called repeatedly, his voicemails oscillating between disbelief, anger, and pleading. I ignored them all. Whatever he had to say could wait until the immediate crisis had passed. 3 days after Vivian's arrest, as I was finally preparing to return to my home, Wilson called with disturbing news. She made bail, he said without preamble. Someone posted a $5 million bond this morning. Who? I demanded, though I already suspected the answer. Wilson's sigh confirmed it. Richard. He claims he believes in her innocence, that this is all a misunderstanding orchestrated by you out of jealousy. Anger flared, hot and sudden. After everything, the evidence, the confession, the poison, he still chooses her? It appears so, Wilson said grimly. And there's more. They've filed a lawsuit challenging your ownership of the estate, claiming Richard was coerced into transferring the deeds solely to your name during the financial troubles 8 years ago. That's absurd, I protested. He signed willingly. It was his idea. I know, Wilson assured me. And we'll fight it. But it complicates matters. With this lawsuit pending, it creates a cloud over the property's legal status. And given Victoria's release on bail, I'm not safe in my own home, I concluded, the realization settling like ice in my veins. Not without significant security measures, Wilson agreed. And even then, I'd be concerned. This woman has proven herself resourceful and determined. And now she has Richard's full support, both financially and emotionally. I closed my eyes, absorbing this new reality. Just when I thought I'd won, the ground had shifted beneath me once again. What do you recommend? I asked finally. A strategic retreat, Wilson said. Not surrender, but a temporary withdrawal to safer ground while we marshal our legal forces. Your sister's place in California, perhaps? At least until the criminal case against Victoria moves forward. California. Julianne's beach house in Malibu, the very place where I'd hidden during my death. There was a symmetry to it that wasn't lost on me. All right, I agreed reluctantly. But this isn't over. I won't be driven permanently from my home, my life. Of course not, Wilson assured me. This is just a tactical decision. And Eleanor. He hesitated. Be careful. Victoria Caruso has everything to lose now. That makes her more dangerous than ever. I hung up and immediately called my children, arranging to meet them at Thomas's apartment to share the new developments. They arrived together, their expressions already concerned. News of Vivian's release had made the local broadcasts. You can't go back to the house, Margaret said as soon as she entered. It's not safe. I know, I admitted. Wilson suggested I stay with Julianne in California until the criminal case is resolved. That could take months, Thomas pointed out. Maybe longer if Richard is financing her defense. I don't have much choice, I said. With her out on bail and a lawsuit pending against the property, my options are limited. They exchanged glances. That silent communication again. We've been talking, Margaret said slowly. And we have another idea. They outlined their proposal. Instead of retreating to California, I would stay with Thomas in the city while they implemented a different kind of plan, one that would expose Richard's complicity and separate him from Victoria once and for all. He's being manipulated, Thomas explained. She's convinced him that you're the villain in this story, that you set her up out of jealousy. We need to show him the truth, concrete evidence he can't deny or explain away. And how do we do that? I asked. Margaret smiled grimly. By giving Victoria enough rope to hang herself. And by making sure Richard is there to witness it. Their plan was audacious, risky, but potentially brilliant. Using Richard's emotional vulnerability and Victoria's growing desperation, they would create a scenario where her true nature would be revealed so unmistakably that even Richard couldn't deny it. It would require careful timing, convincing acting, and the cooperation of Detective Ramirez and Renata. Most dangerously, it would require me to appear vulnerable one last time. It's too risky, I protested. She's already tried to kill me once. If we give her another opportunity. We won't, Thomas assured me. Every step will be monitored, every contingency planned for. She'll believe she has an opening, but it will be completely controlled. I looked at my children, their determined faces, their unwavering resolve to protect me, to fight for justice. They had inherited my stubbornness, my refusal to be victimized. I couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. All right, I conceded. But we do this my way, with every possible safeguard in place. Over the next week, we meticulously crafted our strategy. The central element, a meeting between Richard and me at the estate, ostensibly to discuss settlement terms for the divorce and property dispute. Victoria would inevitably learn of this meeting. We would make certain of it, and would see it as an opportunity to eliminate me once and for all, with Richard present as her unwitting alibi. Except Richard wouldn't be unwitting for long, because we would ensure he witnessed Victoria's true nature, her murderous intent, in a way he couldn't dismiss or explain away. The trap was set for February 14th, Valentine's Day. A cruel irony that appealed to my sense of poetic justice. The Day of Lovers would be the day Richard finally saw the true face of the woman he had chosen over his family. I arrived at the estate precisely at noon, as arranged. The house looked unchanged from the outside, but inside, it had been carefully prepared. Microphones and cameras concealed in strategic locations would record every word, every action. Detective Ramirez and his team were positioned nearby, ready to intervene at the first sign of danger. Richard arrived 15 minutes later, alone as we'd anticipated. Victoria would come separately, believing Richard didn't know she was following him. He looked haggard, older than his years, the strain of recent events evident in the new lines around his eyes. Eleanor, he greeted me stiffly as I opened the door. Thank you for agreeing to meet. Of course, I replied, leading him to the living room where tea had been arranged, a civilized facade for what was to come. I think it's time we discussed our situation like adults. He sat across from me, his posture tense. I want to be clear, I still believe Victoria is innocent of the charges against her. This lawsuit about the house is separate from that situation. I nodded, playing along. I understand. And I'm willing to discuss a reasonable settlement regarding the property. Richard looked surprised. He'd clearly expected more resistance. You are? Yes, I said, pouring tea with steady hands despite my racing heart. I've had time to reflect, and I realize that fighting endlessly benefits no one. Perhaps we can find a compromise. Relief flickered across his face, followed quickly by suspicion. Why this sudden change of heart? I set down the teapot, meeting his gaze directly. Because I'm tired, Richard. Tired of the conflict, the drama, the fear. I want peace. It wasn't entirely an act. I was tired, bone-weary of the constant vigilance, the looking over my shoulder, the knowledge that someone wanted me dead. But peace would only come when Victoria Caruso was no longer a threat. I'm glad to hear that, Richard said cautiously. Victoria will be pleased as well. She's been saying all along that if we could just talk reasonably. Let's not discuss Victoria right now, I interrupted gently. This is between you and me, Richard. 35 years of history. Surely we can find a way forward that respects that. He nodded, seeming to relax slightly. What are you proposing? I outlined a settlement that sounded generous on the surface. Richard would receive a substantial cash payment in lieu of interest in the house, Certain personal items would be returned to him, and I would make no claims against his business assets. As I spoke, I watched the clock on the mantel. Victoria should be arriving soon, if our information was correct. Renata had confirmed that she'd left the hotel 30 minutes after Richard, driving her own car. That sounds fair, Richard admitted when I finished. More than fair, actually. But I'd need to discuss it with my attorney. And with Victoria. Of course, I agreed smoothly. Take all the time you need. More tea. As I reached for the pot, a soft click from the direction of the kitchen caught my attention. Right on schedule. Did you hear that? I asked, feigning concern. Richard frowned. Hear what? I'm not sure. It sounded like the kitchen door. It's probably just the house settling, he dismissed. These old places make all kinds of noises. I nodded, but made a show of glancing nervously toward the hallway. You're probably right. Anyway, about the settlement. A floorboard creaked, louder this time, unmistakable. Richard's head turned toward the sound. Is someone else here? He asked, rising halfway from a seat. I stood, moving to position myself exactly as rehearsed. I don't know. I wasn't expecting anyone. Right on cue, Victoria appeared in the doorway. She wore dark clothes, her hair pulled back severely, and she carried what appeared to be a small handbag. Victoria, Richard exclaimed, surprised despite having been warned she might follow him. What are you doing here? She froze momentarily, clearly not expecting to be immediately noticed. Then her expression smoothed into a practiced smile. Darling, I was worried, she said, her voice honeyed with false concern. When you said you were meeting Eleanor alone, after everything that's happened, I just wanted to make sure you were all right. How did you get in? I demanded, injecting just the right note of fear into my voice. Victoria's smile turned cold. I still have the key Richard gave me months ago, before your miraculous recovery. Richard looked uncomfortable. Victoria, you shouldn't be here. This meeting was supposed to be private. Private, she repeated, her tone hardening. Yes, I'm sure Eleanor would prefer that. Makes it easier to manipulate you without witnesses. No one is manipulating anyone, I said carefully. Richard and I were discussing a settlement. A way to end this conflict peacefully. Victoria laughed. A brittle, dangerous sound. Peace isn't what you want, Eleanor. You want to win. To punish Richard for choosing me, to keep the house, to see me destroyed. She turned to Richard. Can't you see what she's doing? This meeting, this sudden reasonableness, it's all part of her plan. What plan? Richard asked, confusion evident in his face. To separate us, Victoria insisted, moving closer to him. To drive a wedge between us, to make you doubt me. She reached for his hand. Don't let her, Richard. Remember who stood by you when she was supposedly dying. Remember who loved you when she was playing her cruel games. I watched Richard's face, searching for signs that he was beginning to see through her performance. There was doubt there, certainly, but also lingering attachment. Victoria, he said gently, Eleanor has made a fair offer. One that could end this unpleasantness for all of us. Fair, she hissed, dropping his hand. Nothing about this is fair. She faked her death, Richard. She manipulated everyone, including you. She set me up, planted evidence, created this entire fiction about me being some kind of killer. Her voice rose with each accusation. And now you're falling for it again. No one is falling for anything, Richard said, trying to calm her. We're just talking. Victoria's eyes narrowed, her gaze shifting to me. What have you told him? What new lies have you invented while waiting for me to arrive? I knew you were coming, I asked, feigning surprise. Of course you did, she spat. This whole meeting was a setup, wasn't it? Another trap, like at the garden center. Richard looked between us, confusion deepening. Victoria, what are you talking about? She ignored him, her focus entirely on me now. You think you're so clever, Eleanor. Always one step ahead, always the perfect lady of the house. But you're nothing.
Nothing.
And when you're gone, no one will even remember you. The naked hatred in her voice sent a chill through me, despite knowing we were following a script, that help was moments away if needed. Victoria, Richard said more firmly. That's enough. This isn't helping. She whirled on him. Helping? You want to know what would help? If she disappeared, permanently this time. If we could finally be free of her manipulation, her schemes, her constant interference in our lives. You're talking about my wife, Richard said, a note of shock entering his voice. Ex-wife, Victoria corrected viciously. Or she would be, if she would just sign the papers, give up the house, and get out of our lives. I took a deliberate step back, playing my role as the frightened target. I think you should leave, Vivian. Both of you. This meeting is over. Vivian, she mimicked sarcastically. Still can't even use my real name, can you? Still pretending you don't know exactly who I am, what I'm capable of. Victoria, Richard interjected, growing alarm evident in his voice. Let's go. We can discuss the settlement another time, when everyone is calmer. I'm perfectly calm, she said, her voice suddenly dropping to an eerie quietness. Calmer than I've been in weeks, actually, because I've finally accepted what needs to happen. She reached into her handbag, withdrawing not a vial this time, but a small, gleaming pistol. Richard's eyes widened in genuine shock. Victoria, what are you doing? What should have been done months ago, she replied, training the gun on me. What would have happened naturally if she'd actually been dying like she claimed? Put the gun down, Richard demanded, moving toward her. This is insanity. Stay back, she warned, her hand steady despite the emotion in her voice. I don't want to hurt you, Richard. I love you, but Eleanor has to go. She'll never stop otherwise, never stop interfering, manipulating, trying to turn you against me. I stood perfectly still, heart hammering against my ribs. The gun wasn't part of our plan. Victoria was supposed to attempt something more subtle, something that could be plausibly denied later. A gun changed everything, made the danger immediate, undeniable. Victoria, Richard said, his voice shaking now, think about what you're doing. This is murder. It's justice, she countered. She deserves this, Richard. After everything she's done, faking her death, humiliating you in front of everyone, trying to take away your home, turning your children against you. Her finger tightened slightly on the trigger. She's ruined everything. But once she's gone, we can start fresh. Together. I watched Richard's face as the full reality of the situation dawned on him. The scales that had blinded him for so long finally fell away. He was seeing Victoria, truly seeing her, perhaps for the first time. My God, he whispered. It was all true. Everything Eleanor said about you. You did kill those men in Chicago. You did threaten her. Break into the house. Victoria's expression flickered. Surprise, then calculation. Don't be ridiculous. I'm just protecting us. Protecting our future. Eleanor is the threat here, not me. Put the gun down, Richard said again more forcefully.
Now.
Before you do something that can't be undone. She laughed, a hollow, desperate sound. It's already too late for that, Richard. Don't you see? There's no going back. Not for any of us. She refocused on me, her eyes cold and determined. Especially not for you, Eleanor. It's time to say goodbye. For real, this time. Victoria, no. Richard lunged toward her just as she squeezed the trigger. The shot exploded in the quiet room, deafeningly loud. I felt a searing pain across my upper arm as the bullet grazed me, missing its intended target because of Richard's intervention. Everything happened, at once then. The front door burst open, police officers flooding in with weapons drawn. Detective Ramirez's voice boomed. Police. Drop the weapon. Victoria spun toward the new threat, gun still in hand. Richard grabbed for her arm, trying to disarm her. In the struggle, a second shot rang out. Richard staggered backward, a look of shock on his face. A crimson stain blossomed on his white shirt, spreading rapidly across his chest. Richard, I screamed, rushing toward him as he collapsed to the floor. Victoria stood frozen, the gun now hanging limply at her side, her face a mask of horror as she stared at Richard's fallen form. No, she whispered.
No, no, no.
Not you. It wasn't supposed to be you. The police tackled her, disarming her and forcing her to the ground. She didn't resist, her eyes never leaving Richard as officers handcuffed her and recited her rights. I knelt beside Richard, pressing my hands against the wound in his chest, trying desperately to stem the flow of blood. "Stay with me," I urged, my own injury forgotten in the crisis. "The ambulance is coming. Just hold on." His eyes found mine, clouded with pain but suddenly, devastatingly clear. "Eleanor," he gasped.
I'm sorry.
"For everything. I was such a fool." "Don't talk," I instructed, feeling warm blood seeping between my fingers despite my efforts. "Save your strength." Paramedics arrived, gently moving me aside to work on Richard. They cut away his shirt, applied pressure dressings, started in 4. Their expressions were grim as they transferred him to a stretcher and rushed him to the waiting ambulance. "Is he going to make it?" I asked one of the paramedics who remained to examine my arm. "The bullet appears to have struck close to his heart," she replied carefully. "They'll do everything possible, but I can't make any promises. We need to get you to the hospital as well for that arm." I barely felt the pain from my own wound, my mind focused entirely on Richard. Despite everything, the betrayal, the affair, the months of deception, he was still the father of my children, still the man I had loved for 35 years. And in the end, he had saved my life. As I was led to a second ambulance, I passed Victoria being placed in a police car. Our eyes met briefly. The hatred in hers had transformed into something hollow, almost bewildered, as if she couldn't quite comprehend how our carefully constructed plans had collapsed so completely. "This isn't what I wanted," she said as I passed, her voice barely audible. "He wasn't supposed to get hurt. It was supposed to be you." I stopped, turning to face her fully. "It was always going to end this way, Victoria. Violence begets violence. Deception begets deception. You can't build happiness on other people's pain." She had no answer to that, her gaze dropping as officers guided her into the back of the patrol car. I watched as they drove away, taking with them the woman who had nearly destroyed my family, my home, my life. The next hours passed in a blur of hospital corridors, police statements, and anxious waiting. My wound was minor, a deep graze that required stitches, but had missed anything vital. Richard's injury was far more serious. The bullet had missed his heart by centimeters, but had damaged a major blood vessel, causing significant internal bleeding. He was rushed into surgery immediately upon arrival. Thomas and Margaret joined me in the waiting room, their faces pale with shock as I explained what had happened. "She shot Dad," Margaret whispered, tears filling her eyes. "After everything, she actually shot him?" "Not intentionally," I clarified. "He was trying to stop her from shooting me. The gun went off during the struggle." Thomas paced the small waiting area, his expression grim. This wasn't supposed to happen. The plan was for the police to intervene before any violence occurred. "We couldn't have anticipated the gun," I said wearily. "Everything else went according to plan." Richard saw her true nature. He tried to protect me. "At what cost?" Margaret asked, her voice breaking. We had no answer to that, could only wait, hour after agonizing hour, for news from the surgical team. It was nearly midnight when the surgeon finally appeared, still wearing his scrubs, exhaustion evident in his face. "Mrs. Montgomery," he addressed me, "your husband is out of surgery. We've repaired the damaged blood vessel and stabilized him, but he lost a significant amount of blood. The next 24 hours will be critical. But he'll live." I pressed, needing absolute clarity. The surgeon hesitated. "If there are no complications, no infection, no further bleeding, yes, I believe he has a good chance of recovery. But I want to be clear, he's not out of danger yet." Relief washed over me, tempered by the knowledge that Richard's condition remained precarious. "Can we see him?" Briefly, the surgeon allowed. "He's in recovery now, still under anesthesia. Once he's moved to intensive care, you can visit for short periods." We thanked him, then followed a nurse to the recovery area where Richard lay, surrounded by monitoring equipment, his face ashen against the white hospital linens. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by tubes and wires and the heavy weight of what had happened. Margaret took his hand, careful not to disturb the foreline. "Oh, Dad," she whispered. Thomas stood at the foot of the bed, his expression unreadable. "After everything," he said quietly, "he finally did the right thing." I placed my hand on Richard's arm, feeling the warmth of his skin, proof that life still flowed through him, that all was not lost. "Yes," I agreed. "He did." The days that followed established a new rhythm to our lives. The hospital became our second home as we took turns sitting with Richard, who drifted in and out of consciousness as he slowly recovered from surgery. When he was lucid, he spoke little, but his eyes followed me with a mixture of regret and wonder, as if seeing me clearly for the first time in years. Victoria remained in custody, denied bail given the severity of the new charges against her: attempted murder, assault with a deadly weapon, and now attempted murder of Richard as well. The evidence against her was overwhelming. The recorded threats, the gun with her fingerprints, multiple witnesses to the shooting. Her previous crimes in Chicago were being reinvestigated as well, cold cases suddenly warm again in light of recent events. 2 weeks after the shooting, as Richard began to show real signs of recovery, Wilson called with unexpected news. "Victoria Caruso has agreed to a plea deal," he informed me. 20 years with no possibility of parole for the attempted murder charges, in exchange for full confessions regarding Harold Whitman and Gregory Parsons. "She's admitting to the previous murders?" I asked, surprised. "In detail," Wilson confirmed. Apparently, seeing Richard nearly die because of her actions triggered something of a breakdown. She's been cooperating fully with investigators, providing evidence, locations, methods, everything. "And Richard?" I asked. "How does this affect him legally?" "He's in the clear," Wilson assured me. "The prosecution accepts that he was unaware of Victoria's true nature or her criminal intentions. His attempt to protect you from her is being viewed very favorably. As for your unorthodox methods of exposing her, let's just say the authorities are choosing to focus on the positive outcome rather than the questionable tactics." I smiled slightly at the diplomatic phrasing. "And the house? The lawsuit?" "Withdrawn completely," Wilson said. "Richard's attorney contacted me this morning. They're dropping all claims against the property. It seems Richard has had a change of heart about many things." That was putting it mildly. The brush with death had transformed Richard in ways I wouldn't have thought possible. When he was strong enough for extended conversation, he asked to speak with me privately, sending Thomas and Margaret out for coffee. "I need to say this while I have the clarity to do it properly," he began, his voice still weak but determined.
"I'm sorry, Eleanor."
"Not just for Victoria, though God knows that's reason enough. I'm sorry for the affair, for the lies, for taking you for granted all those years." I sat beside his hospital bed, studying the face I had known for 3.5 decades, lined now with age and pain, but still recognizably the man I had married. "Why did you do it, Richard?" I asked, the question that had haunted me for months finally finding voice. "Why her? Why like that?" He was quiet for a long moment, seeming to search for honesty within himself. "It wasn't love," he said finally, "though I convinced myself it was. It was vanity, I suppose. The attention from a beautiful younger woman. The escape from the reality of growing older, of facing my own mortality." He met my gaze directly. "And I was a coward, Eleanor. Too afraid to face the distance that had grown between us, too weak to do the work of repairing it. Victoria, Vivian, offered an easy alternative. All flattery and admiration, no history, no complexity. No reality," I added softly. "No reality," he agreed. "I see that now. She was playing a role, and I was her willing audience. The perfect mark." He grimaced, shifting slightly against his pillows. "The irony is I never stopped loving you. Not really. I just lost sight of what that meant." I felt tears prick at my eyes, not from sentiment, but from the sheer waste of it all. The years of deception, the pain inflicted on our children, the violence that had nearly cost Richard his life and me mine, all because of choices that could have been different, paths that could have been avoided. "I don't expect forgiveness," Richard continued. "I don't deserve it. But I wanted you to know that I understand now. What I threw away. What I nearly destroyed. He reached for my hand, his grip weak but insistent. The house is yours, Eleanor. It always was. Your vision, your creation. I won't contest it further. Thank you, I said simply, allowing him to hold my hand for a moment before gently withdrawing it. For that, and for saving my life. He shook his head slightly. A small redemption against a mountain of wrongs. I couldn't disagree. Some betrayals cut too deep for simple forgiveness. Some wounds left scars that would never fully heal. But as I looked at Richard, fragile, humbled, genuinely contrite, I felt the hard knot of anger within me begin to loosen, just slightly. What will you do now? I asked. When you recover? I'm not sure, he admitted. The business needs attention. I've neglected it these past months. Beyond that, he shrugged carefully, mindful of his healing wound. I have a lot to rebuild. My relationship with Thomas and Margaret, most importantly. I nodded, knowing our children's forgiveness would come even harder than mine. They had witnessed their father's betrayal not just of me, but of the family we had created together. That trust, once broken, would take years to restore, if it ever could be fully. And us? Richard asked, his voice hesitant. Is there anything left to salvage? The question hung between us, weighted with decades of history, with pain both fresh and faded. I considered my answer carefully, wanting neither to offer false hope nor to inflict unnecessary cruelty. I don't know, I said honestly. Too much has happened, Richard. Too many lines crossed. I'm not the same woman I was before all this began. Before I died and came back. Before I had to fight for what was mine. He nodded, accepting this without protest. You're stronger, he observed. Clearer about what you want, what you'll accept. Yes, I agreed. And what I won't accept. Ever again. I understand, he said softly. For what it's worth, I admire the woman you've become, even if that woman has no place for me in her life. I stood, smoothing my skirt with hands that trembled slightly. Let's focus on your recovery first, I suggested. The future will reveal itself in its own time. As I left the hospital that day, I felt lighter somehow, as if setting down a burden I'd carried for too long. Not forgiveness, exactly, that would require more time, more healing on both sides. But perhaps the beginning of acceptance. Of closure. Spring arrived early that year, coaxing green shoots from the dormant earth, bringing renewal to the world outside my windows. By April, Richard had recovered enough to be discharged from the hospital. He moved into a modest apartment in the city, close enough to our children but respectful of the boundaries I had established. Victoria Caruso's sentencing made headlines briefly, then faded from public attention as newer scandals took her place. 20 years behind bars. Justice of a sort, though it couldn't undo the damage she had caused, the lives she had taken or nearly taken. I remained in my home, without qualification or contest. The house where I had raised my children, built my marriage, and ultimately found my strength. I walked its rooms with new eyes, seeing not just what had been, but what could be. Spaces to redecorate, to reimagine, to claim fully as my own. On a warm day in late May, I was in the garden, tending to my roses, the same crimson blooms I'd planted 24 years earlier. Their familiar scent filled the air as I carefully pruned dead growth, making room for new flowering. They're beautiful, a voice observed from behind me. I turned to find Richard standing at the garden gate, looking better than he had in months. The pallor of illness had faded, replaced by the healthy glow of someone who had found his way back from the edge of an abyss. Thank you, I replied, setting aside my pruning shears. They've always been resilient. No matter how harsh the winter, they come back stronger. He smiled slightly at the metaphor, like their gardener. I inclined my head, acknowledging the compliment. What brings you here, Richard? Thomas mentioned you were hosting a dinner tonight. For your birthday. He held out a small wrapped package. I wanted to drop this off, and to ask if you might have room for one more guest. I looked at the package, then at his face, hopeful but restrained. aware that he was asking for more than just a seat at my table. "It's a family dinner," I said carefully. "I know." He met my gaze steadily. "And I know I forfeited my right to be included in that category. But I'm hoping with time." I considered him, this man who had been my husband for 35 years, who had betrayed me, nearly destroyed me, and ultimately saved my life, who stood now at my garden gate, not demanding entry but requesting it, honoring the boundaries I had established. "Dinner is at 7, I said finally. "Don't be late." Relief and gratitude washed across his face. "I won't be." "Thank you, Eleanor." As he turned to leave, I called after him. "Richard." He paused, looking back. "This doesn't mean everything is forgiven," I clarified. "Or forgotten. But it's a start." He nodded, understanding the gift I was offering. Not reconciliation, not yet, but the possibility of a new beginning. A chance to rebuild, on different terms, with clear vision. "A start," he agreed. "That's all I'm asking for." I watched him walk away, then returned to my roses, snipping dead growth to make way for new blooms. Like the garden, like the house, like my life itself, transformed by crisis, tempered by struggle, ultimately renewed. That evening, as my family gathered around the dining table, Thomas and his new girlfriend, Margaret and her husband, even Julianne, who had flown in from California for the occasion, and yes, Richard, seated at the far end from me, I looked around at the faces illuminated by candlelight. We were not the same people who had sat in this room on Christmas Eve, when Vivian had raised her glass and declared herself the lady of the house. We had all been changed by what followed, the revelations, the dangers, the near tragedies. But we had survived. And in surviving, we had found new strength, new clarity about what mattered, what we would fight for, what we would never again take for granted. I raised my glass, catching the light in its crystal facets. To family, I proposed. To truth. To second chances. To the lady of the house, Thomas added, his gaze warm with pride as he looked at me. Everyone drank to that, even Richard, whose eyes held a mixture of regret and hope as they met mine across the length of the table. Later, after the dessert plates had been cleared and the conversation had shifted to lighter topics, I excused myself briefly, stepping out onto the back terrace. The spring night was mild, stars scattered like diamonds across the velvet sky. In the garden below, my roses were silhouettes against the moonlight, their scent drifting upward on the gentle breeze. I breathed deeply, filling my lungs with the sweet air of home, of victory, of peace hard-won but finally, truly mine. From inside came the sound of laughter, Margaret telling one of her museum stories, no doubt, her hands animated as they always were when she spoke of her passion. The warm light from the dining room spilled out onto the terrace, a gentle reminder that I was not alone, that I had never truly been alone. I had faced death, both figurative and literal. I had lost and found myself. I had fought for what was mine and emerged victorious. And now, standing on the threshold between past and future, I made a silent promise to myself. I would never again allow anyone to diminish me, to threaten what I had built, to make me doubt my own worth. I was Eleanor Montgomery, the true and only lady of this house. And my story was far from over. As I turned to rejoin my family, a flicker of movement caught my eye, something small and white on the garden path below. I leaned over the balustrade, trying to make out what it was in the dim light. A porcelain fragment, gleaming in the moonlight. I recognized it immediately. A piece of the doll Vivian had sent months ago, the one with the broken neck and the knife in its chest. Somehow, a shard of it had found its way to my garden, a ghostly reminder of dangers past. I smiled, unafraid. Let it remain there, a small monument to what I had overcome. A reminder that even the most carefully constructed threats could be shattered, reduced to fragments beneath the feet of the woman who refused to be broken. With one last glance at the stars overhead, I returned to the warmth of my dining room, to the family that had weathered the storm alongside me, to the future that, against all odds, still held the promise of joy, of peace, of victory well earned. The door closed behind me, sealing out the night and whatever shadows it might hold. I was home. I was safe. I was triumphant. And somewhere, in a prison cell far from here, Victoria Caruso would spend the next 20 years remembering the woman who had outsmarted her. The woman who had risen from her own staged death to reclaim her life, her home, her dignity. The true lady of the house.
The end.